Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. It's been over 30 years since the first chapter of Berserk was unleashed onto the world, and ever since then, dozens of characters have graced its pages. Some of them, like the Slug Count, the Snake Baron, the Sea God, exist to explain to us the true nature of what Guts faces on a daily basis. Others, like Joachim and Nina, exist to show us how helpless even seemingly insignificant characters can be in the face of their own true nature. All of them find narrative importance irrespective of screen time, which is a testament to Miura-sensei's storytelling capabilities. But out of those dozens of characters, which ones have had the most impact on the way the story has progressed so far? What are their histories and how does it influence their future? What's their role in causality's grand scheme? Well, if you've been wondering about those same questions, then fear not, because we're here to break it all down. Without further ado, these are the backstories and lore of the top 50 Berserk characters explored. Guts. This man has been called by many names across his blood-soaked journey. The Struggler, the 100-Man Slayer, the feared raider captain of the Falcons, the Black Swordsman. You get the picture. Basically, if there's a cool nickname out there for a fierce warrior-type character, Guts had it first. And this isn't without good reason. From the very first moments of his life, Guts has been struggling against the inevitable tide that sweeps us all away, death itself. He was born from the hanging corpse of his birth mother and had to be jostled by his adopted mother into making his first movements as a human, covered as he was in mud in the mire of afterbirth. He lost his adoptive mother at 3, was handed his first sword at 6, killed his first man at 9, and has been fighting in wars ever since. Growing up at a mercenary camp taught Guts the harsh realities of war, as he got molested by one of his fellow soldiers one night after a major battle. He also withstood parental abuse that would have gotten child services called on his stepdad way before their relationship boiled over. As a teenager, Guts resented anyone that tried to touch him, as it reminded him of his trauma, and spent most of his days killing or trying not to be killed. Then he met Griffith and everything changed. Guts found purpose in life greater than just survival by being in the band of the Falcon. He made friends, gained honor and repute as a fierce warrior and raider captain, and eventually fell in love as well. Over the course of 3 years, Guts went from being a lone wolf to having a pack of his own, and it was all thanks to Griffith's belief in him. He would have done anything Griffith asked him to do. He killed a child and abducted another just to help propel the latter's political ambitions. It isn't as though Guts took any pleasure in the former act. His real target was the kid's father, and Adonis himself was tragic collateral. But he did it because he thought he was meaningful to his leader. Then he found out that his leader viewed him only as a tool, and it changed everything for him. Guts realized that he'd only been clinging to someone else's dream, and he didn't have any purpose in life he could truly call his own. He left the band of the Falcon after defeating Griffith effortlessly, despite having lost to the White Falcon twice in the past. This was mostly down to Guts being the more active combatant in recent years, but it didn't stop Griffith from going off on a spiral that ended up dooming the only man whom he treated like an equal. With the advent of the Eclipse, Guts saw the truth of his place in the heart of the man he silently idolized, and that was beneath the maggots that rot within the dirt. The Eclipse took everything from Guts: his friends, his men, his girl's sanity, his right eye and left arm. It returned him to the state of self-isolated rage he was in before he met the Falcons, only now it was worse because he decided his new purpose would be to annihilate every demon associated with the God Hand, followed by them with absolutely no regard for anyone or anything that stepped in his path. Over the course of his one-man war against demonkind, Guts has proved time and again that he's a warrior without peer in the mortal world. He took down 100 Tudor knights all by himself in a single night before the eclipse happened. He'd fought and survived Zod, and he even defeated Wild before the eclipse happened. After it, he took on countless apostles by himself and essentially became a killing machine, to the point they started fearing him. He very nearly lost himself in his own malice, as he thought all people that didn't fend for themselves were ants, until he found friends again. Even with a weapon as dangerous as the Berserker armor being his sole hope to win this one-man war he initiated, it's Guts' new group of companions and renewed hope in restoring Casca's sanity that's kept him moving forward on his own 2 feet. There was a point in the story where he nearly gave in to his inner beast of darkness and assaulted the very woman he'd sworn to protect. But with good company once again surrounding him, and the determination to not let irreplaceable things slip out of his hands again, he'd been doing fine, until Griffith stole his girl again, and Guts couldn't do jack about it. From the day his flesh was emblazoned with the brand of sacrifice, Guts' life forfeit for demonkind. He's known his fate is to end up in the swirling undead mass of the abyss, and resolves only to live life the way he deems it fit up until that point. However, without a positive purpose driving his feet forward, he no longer makes even an attempt to walk. And that's been made abundantly clear in the most recent chapters of Berserk, where we see Guts submitting to enchainment, where he previously would have just hacked his way through his would-be captors. A lot of it is down to the side effects of the Berserker armor itself. It is literally killing him. If you want to know how, go check out our dedicated Berserk playlist. But the fact that Guts seems to have lost his fighting spirit is the most worrying part of the manga these days, not his mortal enemy's next move. His character is all about persevering through insurmountable odds, and it remains to be seen how he manages to struggle his way out of his current predicament. What we can say with certainty is that Guts won't die without setting things right for the world. What'll be interesting to see is just how much more that's going to end up costing him. Speaking of costs, Gambino, one of the most important characters in all of Berserk, also happens to be one who's been dead for a long time, but his impact can be felt on our protagonist's life till this day, and not exactly in the best of ways. When Guts was lying lifeless underneath his birth mother's corpse, a group of mercenaries passed by and found the sight amusing. Then, the mercenaries' leader's disturbed woman brought the baby back to life, and he decided to let her keep it as her plaything, thinking nothing of his men's warnings that the boy might be cursed. Over a decade later, that same man would end up agreeing with the statement, and all because he couldn't see past his own damn self. As a mercenary leader, Gambino was one of the shrewdest characters in the series. He knew when to use decoys to draw out an ambush squad, strategized to take down entire fortresses successfully, and was generally well versed with the art of war. But as a fight trainer, he was terrible. And as a father figure, he was the kind of dad you hear horror stories about. When Guts first came into his life, Gambino thought nothing of him. Even when Shizu was dying because of the plague and Guts was the only thing keeping her going, Gambino would have rather fought a battle than be with his pseudo family. After she passed away, instead of treating him as a reminder of his relationship with Shizu, Gambino treated Guts like a dirty mongrel that he got stuck with for some reason. He teaches Guts how to wield a sword at 6, not because he wants the kid to become a great fighter, but because he wanted him to earn his place in the warband. To Gambino, it was a transactional relationship from the beginning. Guts would be a squire in every sense of the term, and in return all he had to do was give him basic sword training and point him toward the enemy. Even when doing that, he'd tend to forget that Guts is a kid, as during their first training session, Gambino ended up slashing Guts all over and cutting his nose to the bone, all because the kid fought back and actually got a good hit in. Sure, he gave Guts medicine the next morning, but he'd take all of Guts' pay and give him only a token return. And Gambino's lessons were only perceived as lessons by Guts due to his naivety and loneliness. Gambino was the one who sold him out to Donovan for 3 silver coins that fateful night. He once put Guts in a decoy squad, hoping he'd get killed, but turned it into a lesson on survival when the kid survived. Up until the point he himself was able to fight, Gambino didn't mind Guts tagging along. The moment he became an invalid, his bitterness spilled out of him. Gambino started treating Guts worse than a dog he adopted to keep himself company when the rest of his boys were out for a fight. When Guts brought him money to spend on women and wine for himself, Gambino simply told him to get more meat for the dog instead. His bitterness made him resent Guts to the point he blamed the kid for everything wrong in his own life, including Shizu's death, which he didn't mourn even once on screen. Gambino tried to kill Guts one night in a drunken stupor, but ended up getting himself killed and leaving Guts with trauma that he couldn't resolve until he himself became an adult. For a very long time, Guts lived with the guilt of patricide, despite knowing that Gambino had sold him out to Donovan, despite knowing that all Gambino wanted was to be rid of him. Guts acknowledges his father's lessons, but has also unintentionally stepped into said father's shoes. His relationship with his lover and their child is very similar to the one Gambino had with Shizu and him, and while Mr. Bino hasn't been brought up in the story for a while now, you can expect at least one flashback scene with him before the story's finished. Everyone's favourite chestnut wisecracker was introduced as the consciousness that Guts seemed to lack in those early days of the Black Swordsman arc. Puck was being held down by thugs in service of the Snake Baron, the first apostle we see in the series, when Guts rescued him. Although, if you were to ask him, he would have said he was going after the Baron and hurting his boys to get information. Saving Puck was just a coincidence. Turns out, it was one that has saved his life on multiple occasions and also seems to be tied to his ultimate fate. Like we mentioned just a second ago, Puck was brought in to give a voice to the humanity that Guts seemed to lack during the Black Swordsman arc. Guts was a rash, self-preservative, borderline sociopathic individual in those days. He placed little to no stock in the lives of others, and the only thing that seemed to give him any pause was when children got caught in the crossfire, which was also his only redeeming quality back then. Now, if your main character is all about doom and gloom, you're going to need something or someone to bring out his lighter side. And for a very long time, Puck has played that role within Berserk. Not only does he keep reprimanding Guts for treating others like garbage, he constantly helps him out despite their many fallouts, which the Black Swordsman goes on to silently appreciate. Puck hasn't only assisted Guts with his healing powers, he's also helped him out in battles by using his Puck Spark ability, which serves as an excellent flash grenade in a quick pinch. He's Guts' closest confidant at this point, sharing most of his waking moments with the swordsman, except for when he's goofing around with Isidro. It's not an exaggeration to say that Puck is the sole reason Guts even decided to return to Casca after the Lost Children arc, but that's the thematic importance of the elf addressed. Let's get into his storyline as well, because you might not have noticed it, but Causality seems to have a big plan for this little guy. Puck was resident of the magical village of Elfhelm until one day he flew away from Skellig Island and found himself on continental Midland. During his time in this foreign land, he ran into people that, in one way or another, ended up shaping Guts' story. For instance, as the rest of the band of the Falcon get suckered into the eclipse, the only person to not even be a part of the ritual, Rickert, is led to his destination by a troupe of actors who, you guessed it, were accompanied by Puck. During the Campfire of Dreams scene, Judo helped speed up Guts' recovery from his 100-man slaying with some elf dust, which he got from a group with an eerily similar composition as the one that dropped Rickert off to the eclipse site. This implies that elf dust also came from Puck. Puck is the one who suggests taking Casca to his home to help her heal. He's the one who brings the rest of Guts' new traveling companions to him. Moreover, when Puck returned to Elfhelm with Guts and Co in tow, he was greeted by Guru Gedfring, who said that he was fated to go out as a small breeze but return as a gusty tornado. We hate to admit it because of how big it makes his head, but Puck is the link that keeps the Black Swordsman party together, be it through his antics or his knack to come in clutch every time we need him to. Except for when he's put on guard duty, but that's a different matter. It's curious to note that when his homeland disappeared, Puck stayed corporeal. In Berserk, magical creatures are tied to certain spiritual domains, so when the domain appears from the physical world, so do they. Puck, despite being from Elfhelm, is still in the story, which tells us two things. One, he's going to play a role we never expected him to play, and two, when he dies, we'll all yearn for Chestnut Puck's return. Let us know what you think that will be down in the comments, but either way, we'll miss this fourth wall breaking bean when all is said and done. Skull Knight. Speaking of death, let's talk about the dead guy in Berserk, the guy that defines being a vengeful yet righteous spirit, the enigmatic Skull Knight, or to be more precise, the Knight of Skeleton. Skull Knight has only one goal in the story, the destruction of the Inhumans, which includes apostles and of course the God Hand. He's been fighting the God Hand for 1,000 years and has likely seen the birth of each one of them. Considering he can slice and dice his way through dozens of apostles like he was doing meal prep, the fact that he hasn't killed a single one of them tells you a lot about just how powerful the God Hand really is. This isn't to say the Skull Knight isn't superhuman. The speed and strength with which he manages to rescue Guts and Casca from Griffith's eclipse is frankly envious. Also, he's the only guy that's been able to keep a certain Immortal One at bay for close to 300 years, despite said Immortal One being the strongest of his kind. So, Skull Knight is definitely an extremely strong character within the Berserk verse. However, his narrative importance outweighs all that because he's a reflection of both the antagonist and the protagonist of this story. If you've seen any of our videos on the Skull Knight, you know that we think he's the vengeful spirit of Supreme King Geyserik. Now, in Chapter 53, when Geyserik's rise to power is being divulged to Guts, he thinks that this guy sounds a lot like Griffith. Both men appeared on the world stage out of nowhere, had undefeated armies under their command, and aspired to become the ruler of all mankind. Only difference is, Geyserik did it, and Griffith at this point was on his way to doing it. Then he learns what Geyserik was called in his day, and Guts immediately thinks of the Skull Knight because both men share a characteristic, wearing a skull-shaped helmet. It's revealed later in the series that Skull Knight was the previous owner of the Berserker armor, and considering the armor's helmet was in the shape of a skull the first time Guts donned it, you start understanding just why Geyserik was called down as the dreaded Skull King back in his day. And then in Chapter 362, we learn that he died wearing the Berserker armor during an event not unlike Griffith's eclipse, where Geyserik sees his mortal enemy and the Archangel of Demonkind take form. Since the Berserker armor took his body, Geyserik had Hanar put his vengeful spirit into the skeletal armor we see him wearing, so he can find a way to kill the God Hand. Skull Knight sees a lot of himself in Guts, which is why he dubs him Struggler. He's appeared to Guts multiple times in the series to either warn him or assist him in dealing with temporal junction points, and 9 times out of 10, he's been right about everything. It drives Guts crazy that he's right so many times too. But hey, when you've been at fighting demons for a millennium, you pick up a thing or two, like interpreting the flow of causality or creating a wicked space-ripping Behelit sword as the ultimate final weapon. Skull Knight's sword of actuation is the only weapon in the series that we can even consider of being at God Hand level, and that's down to its power source. Since it's created from repurposed Behelits, the Skull Knight can send his targets to the abyss, trapping them within it forever. If he gets a God Hand member with even a single temporal slash, it's over for them. But on the flip side, the one time he tried to use it for its intended purpose, he kinda broke the world. Skull Knight tried to trap Femto, failed, and his spatial sword slash became the catalyst for the great roar of the astral world. He's been rather non-combative since then, choosing to act more like a guide, probably because he knows what he's unleashed onto the world. As the previous owner of the Berserker armor, Skull Knight knows exactly what Guts is going through, and perhaps he's the only one who can help him convalesce. But following Elfhelm's destruction and the crew's capture by the Kushan, it's hard to say when Skull Knight will return to the story. One thing we can say for sure though, is expect him to spout off at the mouth about causality again, and be prepared to see him be proven correct one more time. Casca. Every story needs a good leading lady to carry its emotional burden, but to call Casca's character arc in Berserk tragic would be a gross understatement. The woman has been through hell on earth. Born the youngest in a family of 8, Casca had it rough her entire childhood. Her family lived in a border village which was subject to constant raids and crippling poverty. They lived off scraps, and being the youngest of the family, and a girl at that, meant Casca's days at home were likely numbered. One day, a nobleman passing through the village offered to take her on as a servant, and her family, eager to have one less mouth to feed, sold her to him. Turns out he was only interested in what's between Casca's legs, and they didn't even cross the village border when he tried to assault her. That's when she first met Griffith. The leader of the Falcons didn't just save her from a would-be rapist, he gave her a sword and taught her how to fight for herself. He gave her a blanket to cover herself with, and when she asked to join up with his band, knowing the fate awaiting her at home, Griffith gave her a meaningful place in the world. Casca considered him her personal god from that day forward and dedicated her life to becoming his sword. She rose through the ranks of the Band of the Falcon quickly, becoming second in command and the second best swordsman behind Griffith himself. She enjoyed a position of respect and got to be close to her idol, which was good enough for her. But then Guts entered her life and everything was turned on its head. Initially, their relationship was extremely contentious, as Casca hated what she perceived to be insubordination on Guts' part. The fact that Griffith gave him most of his attention didn't help, and despite the unity on the battlefield, the Falcons would always have this inner war raging on between them. Then Guts saved her life and she started catching feelings for him. Casca made a peace with Griffith needing to marry Charlotte, and when he committed treason, she took over control of the Falcons, keeping them alive on the run from the King's wrath. When Guts came back to rescue her and his friends, she was pissed at him initially, but eventually ended up starting a relationship with him, which is beautifully documented in the Wounds chapter. Casca is the reason Guts doesn't recoil from people's touch anymore, and she helped him resolve years of trauma just by accepting him for what he is. It's too bad that that's the last time she was truly happy, and by the looks of things, will ever be. Shortly after rescuing Griffith, Casca became the most horrific victim of the eclipse. While the rest of her comrades died, she was personally violated by the man she used to idolize, who had now given his soul over to demonkind. This broke her mind, and for the next 3 years, Casca existed in a childlike state, vulnerable to all kinds of abuses if not looked after properly. She was abandoned by Guts when she needed him most, and when he came back to her, it was too late. Though he managed to save Casca from becoming barbecue meat, he also ended up nearly assaulting her, which pretty much isolated him from her completely. The only person she could trust was a reformed religious fanatic, and even when she got her mind back, Casca still couldn't face Guts because he gave her PTSD flashbacks to the eclipse. Then she got kidnapped by her assaulter and taken to his magic fortress, where she now spends her days in a daze, thinking she's a noblewoman from Falconia. Just when you think things can't get any worse for her, they do. And we're not even sure she's going to make it out of the story, resembling a fraction of her former self. When Skull Knight told Guts that Casca's mind could be healed by the Monarch of Elfhelm, he warned her that his wishes might not be hers. Most people think that this relates to those PTSD flashbacks of hers, as Guts wanted to be with Casca, but she physically can't do so. But we think it has more to do with their stances on another character, whom we'll discuss later on in the list. Suffice it to say, if the worst case scenario occurs, having bite marks on her bosom will be the least troubling thing Guts has ever done to her. And in the best case scenario, we see her give Griffith a taste of his own medicine, though we know that's hoping against hope. Judo. Now it's time to talk about the Captain Jack Sparrow of all trades, the knife-throwing, all-knowing Axel of the Band of the Falcon. The main man, Judo. This short king is one you don't want to make the mistake of underestimating, because while he has a smile plastered to his face for the most part, he'll mess you up if you step to him. No questions asked. Judo was the first character to treat Guts with kindness in the series, canonically speaking, because Guts doesn't link up with Puck until well after the eclipse. Judo welcomed Guts into the band with open arms and encouraged him to find a place for himself within it, but he could sense the immense loneliness Guts carried with him everywhere. Judo was a highly perceptive person, having spent his formative years with a troop of mummers, possibly the same one that helps out Rickett later on. He learnt a lot about the human nature and the world at large. He was one of the first people to join Griffith's budding warband, drawn to the man's charisma like all others. Like we mentioned at the beginning of this entry, Judo is the Jack Sparrow of all trades. He isn't the best swordsman, he isn't the best marksman, he isn't the best horseman, but he's got adequate expertise on all those things. So much so that Judo is often the one leading rescue parties in Griffith's stead. And besides, his main role within the band is to provide top-tier intel and maintain its integrity. Fighting is one of his lesser concerns. Judo is a man with a wealth of worldly knowledge. He knows about the military composition of kingdoms and empires far away from Midland, as evidenced by his identification of Bakiraka assassins and Kushan weapons during a raid on his warband. He's aware of the existence of astral creatures, which is how he procured that elf dust we spoke of earlier. Turns out, this pouch of healing medicine is how Judo had been secretly thriving in a world of violence, as it saved him from many life-threatening injuries. He also knows of the fairy tale of the Skull King, which is a folk remembrance of Skull Knight's time as King Geyserik. Also, Judo was the one who realized that the reason Griffith wasn't being able to capture a Tudor fortress in Chapter 2 of the manga was because it was being defended by the battlefield god Nosferatu Zod. To be completely honest with you guys, if Judo would have asked out about any of us, would have been an instant yes. But he's such a selfless guy that he puts his feelings for Casca aside and actually advises Guts to pursue a relationship with her. Judo's always been the kind of person to put others' priorities over his own, and sadly, that's what ended up getting him killed. Judo was aware of the darkness within Griffith's heart. He knew Griffith was making Guts commit assassinations and arson to further his own political agendas. While he disagreed with the methods, he didn't argue with the outcome because, at the time, they served his needs as well. But after spending a year on the run from 70% of Midland's army and realizing that the man he once looked up to was nothing more than an invalid, Judo made the practical decision to leave and start a band of thieves. We'd have loved to see that spin-off series, but then the eclipse happens and Judo's life is brought to a brutal end. Everyone else in that infernal ceremony was concerned only with themselves. Judo went out to protect Casca and keep her alive as long as possible because to him, the band survived if she survived. In his final moments, he did everything to protect the woman he loved, and he died thinking while he's usually a slick talker, he couldn't even tell Casca that important thing. Judo's death was one of the most tragic deaths in those early days of Berserk, and it's one that still haunts his surviving teammates. Corkus. But you know someone who probably isn't as missed at all? It's this guy, and the reasons, quite frankly, are inarguable. Fun fact, Corkus is the reason Guts was recruited into the Band of the Falcon. No, he wasn't a recruiter. He picked a fight he couldn't win, and ended up getting his friends killed in the process. After watching Guts slay Bazuso the Grey Knight, one of their best fighters, Corkus decided he wanted to rob the wayward mercenary and thought overwhelming him with numbers was going to cut it. Long story short, it didn't. Guts became Griffith's best recruit ever, and Corkus found himself having to cohabit with a guy he tried to kill and failed. From a character role standpoint, Corkus was the pot stirrer of the group. Whenever he'd smell a conflict brewing between two people he didn't like, he'd always make it worse. And you don't even want us to start talking about his lechery. The women of Midland know what we're talking about. But the one thing Corkus did better than anyone else was telling things like they were and prioritizing the band over its members' feelings. Corkus is the only one who calls out Guts on his BS. While we agree that in order to find himself, Guts had to go away from the band, Corkus called out his hypocritical self-victimization over it because he knew that this was nothing more than Guts being selfish. When Guts returned to the band after a year of being away from them, Corkus didn't accept him because if he was their friend, where was he for the past year? How come he didn't even hear about them being persecuted? Corkus's pessimism toward Guts isn't always justified, but when it comes to pointing out flaws, he's an expert, and Guts always appreciated that about him. Whenever Corkus would pipe up with his disapproval of something Guts did, our hero tended to agree with him, even if he didn't always say it out loud. Corkus's loyalty and dedication to Griffiths are also noteworthy, because he believed in his leader even after finding out he could no longer lead them. Miura decided to make us feel bad for feeling like Corkus was a bad person at the very end of his life, because in his final moments, Corkus lost his mind and started thinking the past few years of his life had been nothing but a dream. Within the madness of the eclipse, Corkus lost himself and blamed everything that had happened on a part of his imagination he was going to snap out of at any moment. He thought he was right in thinking it was all a dream when he saw a naked woman in front of him when his friends were being slaughtered by monsters. But when Corkus embraced her, she ate him alive, and it was then that we truly felt sorry for the guy. In a show of poetic irony, the female apostle that ate him was the very first apostle we see Guts killing in the manga. Even though Corkus despised him, Guts avenged his former comrade's death, and that's about as good as things get for the old Band of the Falcon. Pippin. The silent giant of the Band of the Falcon, Pippin was a near-constant presence in the Golden Age arc, although he played mostly two roles: brutalizing fools on the battlefield and cajoling Guts into acting like a human again. When Guts first joined the Falcons, he was asked by Rickett and Judo to join their victory feast, but Pippin didn't wait. He just lifted him up and plopped him in the middle of the festivities. It's not like Guts didn't try to resist this. This was pre-trauma resolution Guts, so he immediately elbowed Pippin full in the face when the latter picked him up. Now, that would usually knock someone out cold, or at the very least, leave them with a broken face. Pippin only got a bloody nose off it, which is a testament to his strength. He fought using a giant mace, and when he and Guts were back to back, they were dubbed the power duo of the Band of the Falcon. But the main reason Pippin gets a place on this list is that he's the one who shows us that Griffith might be broken because of the torture, but he was far from being dead. Pippin used to be a miner before he joined the band. That's likely where he got his inhuman strength and physique from. After joining up with them, he became a devoted soldier of Griffith's. He fought in countless battles and followed orders without question. When they were rescuing Griffith from his prison cell in Midland and ran into a bit of an explosive situation in the sewers, Pippin was the one who saved their lives. Being trapped in a sewage tunnel and faced with the prospect of gunpowder burning them into a crisp, Pippin used his mining expertise to redirect the female Bakuraka's flames away from them. He did so by smashing a hole in the roof. which allowed the fire to escape the tunnel. He claims that he knew this kind of thing would work because of his experiences mining, but the only reason it did work is because Griffith showed him an opening. It's quite ironic that the man who led Pippin to his safety in that moment also led him to his doom in the near future. When the eclipse was triggered, Pippin was one of the only Falcons able to withstand and actually fight back against the tide of apostles. He held off one of these demonic monsters from getting to Casca, while Judo escaped with her. Pippin had resolved to die in that moment, and his thinking was the same as Judo's. If Casca survived, so did the band. He ended up getting dismembered and used as bait by the Slug Count, and was avenged by Guts 2 years later when the Black Swordsman absolutely wrecked Tiresias' father. There's another reason that Pippin is on here, and that's because his design is based off of none other than Kentaro Miura himself. Miura based the OG band off of a friend group he used to have, and he made Pippin in his own image. The resemblance is clear when you juxtapose their faces, and we just recalled that they're now both gone from this world, so we're going to need a second to recover. Rickert. Who would have thought that this little dude would grow up to be the biggest Chad in all of Berserk? Not in a million years did we think that the kid who helped out with repairs would end up slapping a god hand right in the face. But hey, that's Big Ricky. Back when he was Little Ricky, he was known for being a proficient weaponsmith, a kid that spoke his mind, and an absolute cutie pie. Just look at the reaction he got from the noble women of Midland during his ascension ceremony. But at his core, Rickert has always been a character that's too emotionally mature for his age, and that kind of maturity brings with it a gentleness that makes him feel more childlike than he really is. For instance, when Guts got recruited into the Falcons, Corcus was bummed and ranting about it to Rickert and Pippin. But Rickert pointed out that it was Corcus's decision to rob Guts that got him recruited, and their friends killed, which is an astute observation for a teenager to make. Yet, when Guts saved his life during his first night as a Falcon, Rickert instantly idolized him, and things stayed that way for a long time. Rickert was always looking up to Guts and cried buckets upon his exit from the Falcons. But spending years on the run and then seeing his comrades die needless deaths at the hands of monsters aged the young boy, and he became a man determined to live his life protecting those who were precious to him. Rickert is one of 3 OG Falcons to survive the eclipse, and the only one to not get branded as a result of him being put in the reserve unit of the Falcons. He goes on to help Guts and Casca escape the eclipse site, brings them to Godot's home with Skull Knight, and spends the next 2 years as the blacksmith's apprentice. Turns out, Rickert is a genius engineer, as he's the creator of Guts' metal arm, hand cannon, rapid-fire crossbow, mini-bombs, and pretty much everything that isn't Dragon Slayer. He goes on to reverse engineer fire extinguishers during his time at Falconia, upgrade them into medieval flamethrowers, and even makes a goddamn rocket launcher capable of halting apostles in their tracks. While Rickert was unaware of the truth behind what caused the eclipse, he nonetheless mourned his fallen brothers and found new purpose in his life with Godot and his granddaughter, Erika. This is why, when Griffith returned as an incarnated Femto, he was happy to see him at first, and then confused as to why Guts was fighting their leader, and why said leader was seemingly aligned with Nosferatu Zod. When Guts tells him the truth of what happened, Rickert breaks down and offers to join up with him, but Guts rejects it because he knows Rickert can't truly hate Griffith like him. So Ricky stays with Erika, works through his emotional turmoil himself, and when the great roar of the astral world occurs, travels to Falconia with her for their collective safety. Once there, he's immediately summoned to meet with Griffith, but when he realizes that his former leader is using the very creatures that killed their former friends as his new soldiers, he decides he doesn't want to stay beside Griffith after all. Rickert lands the slap heard around the world right on Griffith's cheeks, and makes his way to Kushan lands with Silat and Daiba, both of whom realize the significance of that act. At this point in the story, not even Guts has been able to land a blow on Griffith, which makes Rickert the key to understanding how to bring down a god hand. And the fact that he's essentially bringing the Avengers together currently, as he's united the Black Swordsman party with the remnants of the Kushan Empire being led by Silat, shows just how important he's going to be to the endgame of Berserk. Rickert represents goodness and hope in a way that no other character does, and he isn't fated to end up in the abyss like his comrades. Maybe when all's said and done, he'll end up personifying the opposite of the idea of evil. After all, his importance in the grand scheme of things has been hinted at multiple times by Skull Knight's reactions to him. And if there's anyone that deserves to get a good aligned power boost in this story, it's Mr. Stand on Business himself. Zod. The exact opposite can be said for this man. Although we can't deny that he puts his brutish strength to good use when the occasion calls for it. It's too bad that those occasions are usually him massacring soldiers he knows are far inferior to him in terms of raw power. The enigmatic god of the battlefield. Nosferatu Zod has roamed this world for nearly 300 years as an apostle. In that time, he's fought countless human beings and apostles, but never found a challenge that lived up to his strength beyond Skull Knight, of course. Their rivalry is one of the foundational conflicts in Berserk, and that probably has a lot to do with their respect for each other. We know nothing about Zod's past, save that he's called the Immortal One because he just doesn't die. We can assume that he was a warrior in his human life because of his extreme proficiency in the art of warfare, and that he became an apostle to satisfy his ultimate desire, to fight the absolute strongest greatest being in existence. For a long time, he believed he wouldn't get such a chance, but then Femto proved him wrong in Chapter 128, and since then, Zod has been his most loyal follower. It wasn't always like this. In fact, Zod tried to kill him in their first encounter, but when he realized that Griffith was the bearer of the Crimson Behelit, the Immortal One understood Griffith's importance in the grand scheme of causality. He spared the cub and went on to facilitate the events that led to the eclipse. Zod threw the sword that helped Griffith win the 100-Year War. He killed the apostle that threatened to kill Griffith and told him that his lost Behelit would come back to him when he needed it most, because, well, that's how things worked around here. Zod had also spread the word about Griffith's future status as the 5th God Hand member, which is probably why the band didn't get attacked by apostles on their year-long existence as fugitives. Maybe they knew these guys would end up as sacrifices anyway. Upon Griffith's incarnation, Zod becomes his primary general and mode of transportation, and the Immortal One helps him achieve many victories in the New World. Zod is an absurdly powerful apostle to begin with. When he transforms, he looks like a bipedal cross between King Kong and a black lion, with horns sharper than an African water buffalo's, and paws so powerful they could swipe an armored human clean in half. He has a massive tail which he can use to leverage himself. And to add insult to injury, Zod can sprout wings when the occasion calls for it. He can withstand thunderbolts that fry apostles like flies, and has fought and survived multiple encounters with the Skull Knight thanks to his regenerative powers. Zod is the ultimate apostle, and so it begs the question, why is that the case? Zod isn't necessarily motivated by servitude. To him, strength is everything, and Griffith earned his service by defeating him. But why is this 300-year-old Black Lion of Doom the strongest apostle in the series? Is it because of his age? Is it because of his obsession with power? Well, we'll either never know or find out in the next offensive Griffith orchestrates, because causality seems to be converging toward the east. And given that Zod is Griffith's flying chariot, expect him to be at ground zero for all of his moves, like he has been so far. Charlotte. Princesses in the Grimm Brothers stories have better fates than the one reserved for this girl. And it's a damn shame too, because Princess Charlotte is one of the most likable nobles in all of Berserk. Charlotte Beatrix Marie Rhodey Wyndham is the only child of the King of Midland and heir apparent to the throne. Her birth mother died when she was still a child, and Charlotte has grown up with a stepmom for the better part of her life. Relations between the two were professional, at best. Charlotte is introduced as something of a shut-in princess, who only went where her father took her, but that changed when he bumped into the love of her life, Griffith. Seeing the White Falcon knocked the breath out of Charlotte, and as they got closer over the course of Griffith's residency in Wyndham, it became clear that the princess had fallen in love with him. When an assassination attempt was made on his life, Charlotte took the blame, thinking the crossbow bolt was meant for her, as she was the princess. She gave Griffith one half of a lodestone her mother gave her when he left to capture Doldry, hoping he'd return to her safely. When Griffith showed up at her chambers that fateful night, Charlotte resisted his advance out of dignity at first, and then gave in, thinking what she was experiencing was reciprocal love. She went on to isolate herself from her father, who went insane in his persecution of his daughter's defiler, and even helped orchestrate Griffith's escape. Turns out that the spy that was helping the rogue band of the Falcon track their imprisoned leader's location was none other than Princess Charlotte, and her love for him made her do things no princess would usually do. She not only lied to and bribed guards to help the Griffith rescue team enter Wyndham, she personally went with them, took a poison arrow for Griffith, and even begged her father to stay off her lover's trail in exchange for her obedience. When her father died, all she could think of was Griffith, and so was the case when Charlotte was captured by the dreaded Kushan Emperor, Ganishka. She spent all of her time sewing silhouettes of her Prince Charming, hoping one day he would rescue her. And then one day, he did. Griffith appeared in her chambers from out of nowhere and flew her out of her prison with Zod's assistance. To Charlotte, this was a dream come true. Her lover had returned to save her from her cruel life and fulfill her heart's desire. She betroths herself to him and gives him command over Midland's regular army, making him the de facto political and military leader of humanity in the process. And now that Falconia has been constructed on the site where Wyndham once stood, Charlotte eagerly awaits for the day of her wedding. Although we think it's a naive hope because unbeknownst to her, she's given Griffith everything he was hoping to get out of her without even realizing it. With one decision made out of blind love, she handed over humanity's fate to a literal demon king. And the reason we call her fate worse than any princess in a Grimm Brothers story is because Charlotte still doesn't know that she's sleeping with a demon. She thinks all that Griffith does is genuine, when that couldn't be farther from the truth. She thinks Griffith supports her decisions in council out of love and loyalty, when in fact it's just to keep up appearances until his behind-the-scenes chess moves sort themselves out. Now that Casca has been brought to Falconia, it's only a matter of time until Charlotte either meets her or realizes how Griffith is keeping her there. Both outcomes will open her eyes to the monster she loves. What she does next is anyone's guess, because her wedding to Griffith is being built up as a major event. Given that it'll cement his position as Falconia's ruler, maybe he'll dispose of Charlotte the moment he gets coroneted. Maybe he'll put her in a trance similar to Casca's, or maybe he'll give her over to his apostles for their amusement. We won't put any of those things as being beneath Griffith. and that's why we're worried about the sleeping princess. Laban, one of Griffith's first supporters in royal council and one of his fiercest loyalists following the Great Roar of the Astral World, General Laban plays a crucial role in furthering the White Falcon's agendas. At the strategy meeting before the Battle of Doldrey, Laban is the only one to speak up on behalf of Griffith's undefeated record, and he displays complete confidence in his ability to deliver what he promised. He's one of the first people to react to the second attempt on Griffith's life, and remains convinced that he's a great guy even after the king dedicates 70% of his fighting forces to hunting him down. Years later, Laban is surveying the towns of Midland and realizes that they've been struck by the plague. He recalls the prophetic dream that likely all of humanity experienced, and concludes that the Falcon of Light that would deliver them salvation could be none other than Griffith himself. As the leader of the Arklow Knights, he infiltrates Kushan-occupied Windham and helps organize the resistance group within for evacuation. When the time comes, Laban manages to save every citizen of Midland, including the women imprisoned by the Kushan, and lead them out of the city wearing garments and carrying weapons that were mysteriously disposed by their captors. Once he meets up with the Band of the Falcon, Laban becomes a part of the army that takes part in the final battle of the Old World. Like everyone else present on the field, he's shocked that Griffith would employ literal demons in his army. But with a bit of clever OD manipulation from Griffith's seer, all doubts are removed from the minds of the human onlookers. Laban then joins the fight, emerges victorious alongside his fellow Falcons, and becomes one of the prominent human commanders of the new Band of the Falcon. As a member of Falconia's first line of defense, Laban works to rescue refugees fleeing toward Midland from the creatures of the New World, and oversees bureaucratic affairs at the Refugee Bureau of Falconia. On one of his rescue missions, he comes across Rickett, whom he recommends to the city's smithing guild, and for an audience with the Falcon of Light himself. It's curious that Laban doesn't recall anyone from the old band besides Griffith, especially when you see the next entry, but it'd make more sense when you consider that Laban is one of the many who's completely with Griffith on this journey to establish a new world order. He marvels at Griffith's Jesus-like accomplishments, calling his exploits with the new band daily miracles, and argues that any division within the residents of Falconia will be put to rest once they see their divine leader deliver them from their mortal coils. Laban is kind of a soft fanatic in that sense, in that he doesn't get belligerent about defending his faith in Griffith, but he has unshaken confidence in him all the same. This contrasts with the next person on our list, who's also Laban's best mate amongst nobility. Another member of Midland nobility that supported Griffith in his early days, Owen was a critical thinker amongst men obsessed with self-preservation. From the moment he saw other commanders ridiculing Griffith's claim of being able to deliver the impregnable fortress of Doldrey with nothing but his own warband, Owen knew that the White Falcon was something special. He was proven correct in thinking so because not long after, Griffith delivered Doldrey to the King of Midland. Owen and his good friend Laban bought into the dazzling vision that Griffith's potential exuded, and the fact that he was undefeated in battle made his appeal that much more enticing for young knights like themselves. But unlike Laban, who took a more on-the-ground approach to things, Owen stuck closer to the royal palace. It was a decision made out of complete loyalty to the throne and its authority. Throughout the Conviction and Millennium Falcon arcs, Owen was the only nobleman looking out for Midland's safety rather than his own. He's an extremely empathetic individual, as he thought the nobles scheming for Charlotte's favour were vile, and the burden she would be forced to carry now that her father was gone was too much for a girl like her. After the Kushan occupation of Midland, him and Laban split up and decided to achieve two separate objectives in service of a common goal. While Laban took his Arklow Knights to infiltrate Windham and arrange an evacuation, Owen travelled to Vritannis to seek aid for plagued Midland. While other Midlanders fought with each other with regards to their prospects in the New World, Owen consolidated them by reminding them of their sacred duty. He did it once again when it was revealed that Princess Charlotte had survived and that Griffith was the man leading her armies. While other noblemen bickered about tradition and social dogma and such things, Owen reminded them that without Griffith, their conversations would be worthless. His affirmation of faith to his new leader made the rest of the Midlanders, and then the Holy See leaders, fall in line. After the creation of Falconia, Owen was made the head of the Falcon's Castle's Guard. He sits in Falconia's council as well, as a principal overseer of city affairs. And this is where we think Owen distinguishes himself from the rest of the people gathered in Falconia. For starters, Owen has always been an objective person. Even after Griffith's incarnation, while he acknowledges the Falcon's innate magnetism, he suspects that something otherworldly is at play. In Falconia's council sessions, Owen often brings up topics of dissension. For example, he addressed rising division and heresy within Falconia and was the only one in that meeting to actually bring up a dissenting topic. Where Laban frequently just blindly follows and praises Griffith, Owen's approach to his new leader is more philosophical, which can be seen when he breaks down the soul-departing ceremony for Rickett. He recognized Rickett the moment he stepped into the Falcon's castle and seemingly wanted to talk to him about something before he was called called away to deal with a thief. When he was in Britannis, he was one of the people trapped in the Van Diemen ballroom when Ganishka tried to wipe out the nobility, and he recognized Guts as the raider captain of the Band of the Falcon. While at that time his priority was to liberate his people, now that that's been achieved, will Owen become the one who uncovers Griffith's true nature? It's quite possible, as he seems to care more about his people's safety than the Falcon's prosperity, but that's just our estimate. Foss, going from a nobleman whose personality has been consistent throughout to one who's been transformed as the series progressed. Many of you might remember Minister Foss as the man that tried to kill Griffith the moment he attained peerage. The short, bald-headed minister was one of the shrewdest Berserk characters during the Golden Age arc. Using his political connections to the Queen of Midland and the rest of the high-ranking nobles, he plotted not one but two assassination attempts on Griffith's life. For Foss, the motivation was self-preservation. Like every other noble in the Court of Midland, he couldn't abide by a commoner like Griffith joining their ranks, so he manipulated the king's brother into having a go at things first, and then when he died, he created a secret society to kill Griffith, which included the Queen as well, sealing their commitment to their goal with a blood oath. But when Griffith took his daughter hostage, all of Foss's political machinations fell to the wayside, because he realized he wasn't dealing with a toothless tiger, but a falcon whose talons could shred metal. Griffith became aware of Foss's ill intent toward him through a single interaction, and when he kidnapped his daughter, Foss realized just how badly he'd been outplayed. He not only helped Griffith fake his death, he also helped him take out his political rivals by trapping them in a tower and setting it ablaze. Of course, Foss wasn't the one holding the torch, but then Griffith wasn't the one giving him directions either because he was dead. Once the White Falcon released Foss's daughter, the minister became terrified of him and resolved to never oppose him again. The thing that scared him most was Griffith's nonchalant offer of friendship after he'd just eliminated all of Foss's friends. Perhaps that's why, when the people of Midland saw the prophetic dream of the Falcon, Foss became one of the first believers in Griffith's return. He was the one who organized the Windham Resistance Force when the city was under Kushan occupation, and following their liberation, Foss has dedicated himself to seeing Griffith's vision come to life. During the Falconia Council meeting that takes place in Chapter 358, Foss not only actively promotes policies that would make the commoners receive better living standards than ever before, he also openly praises Griffith's grand vision to establish a second continental empire. This complete 180 turn feels suspect, yet Foss knows full well the cost of crossing Griffith. Perhaps it's a mixture of fear and reverence that drives him, but once he realizes the truth of Griffith's existence, then what? Foss is one of the few people who have tried to have the Falcon of Light killed, so he has some expertise in the field. Being close to Falconia's council, he could be the perfect mole for those who oppose Griffith, like Guts and Silet and the rest. Whether he'll put aside his pacifist ways and retake his mantle of master manipulator remains to be seen, but we can say one thing with certainty: Foss is in the story for a reason beyond mere groveling, and that'll become clear as we get closer to the end game. Julius. One of the earliest prominent antagonists of Berserk, General Julius was the brother of the King of Midland. Unlike his brother, he was brash, arrogant, too much pride in being a nobleman, and it was that pride of his which eventually kept him from potentially replacing the king. Remember how we said a few minutes ago that Princess Charlotte was the sole heir apparent to the throne? Well, that was a half lie, because she only became the sole heir apparent after the real heir apparent passed away. Or rather, heir apparents, as you'll see in just a moment. Being the king's brother, Julius was second in line to the throne of Midland, as the kingdom itself is based off medieval dynasties where male inheritance was given privilege over female inheritance. Julius naturally came before Charlotte in the line of succession. If his brother were to suffer some ill fate, he'd become king of Midland. If that didn't happen, Julius was already preparing his son Adonis for knighthood and as a potential groom for Princess Charlotte. You see, despite being a hot-headed elitist, Julius had ambitions and plans in place to see through those ambitions. His wife died a few years before the series is set, so he took his brother's wife as his mistress. He was already the leader of the White Dragon Knights, Midland's highest-ranked fighting force, and with Adonis and Charlotte's marriage, his hold over the throne would be complete. We've never seen Julius show any outward hatred for his brother, but his disagreement with the king on multiple topics, including Griffith's inclusion in Midland's war campaigns, suggest as much. And speaking of Griffith's inclusion, Julius has no one to blame for that but himself. Despite being the leader of the White Dragon Knights and a formidable warrior, he got himself captured by Tudor in his last offensive against them. The ransom the king had to pay for his release was immense, and his White Dragon Knights took a back seat to the Band of the Falcon ever since. Julius was so hung up on his status that he took his focus off the war and made getting rid of Griffith his first priority. He made his best archer snipe Griffith with a crossbow bolt coated with a rare toxin, but to everyone's shock, Griffith ended up being saved by his magic necklace. The White Falcon, whose intuition is always on point, realized who tried to have him killed and decided to pay him back with the same coin. Griffith commissioned Guts to take out Julius, and the future Black Swordsman did him one better. He killed Julius's son as well. With all male competition to his potential claim removed, Griffith dug his talons into Princess Charlotte's heart and managed to rip her away from her family. Though Julius would have been a brute of a king most likely, he would have been a human one at the very least. His death felt like vindication when it occurred, but by the time the eclipse happened, we kinda wished Julius had succeeded. And that's a testament to Kentaro Miura's storytelling ability. Speaking of Griffith and feelings, Genon, one of the most disgusting characters in the series by far. Governor Genon has a, well, shall we say, storied relationship with the series' main antagonist. Long before Griffith became the fabled hero of Midland, his band actually fought for the other side. Genon is a Tudor official, after all. During that time, Griffith not only fought for Genon, but also slept with him as a means to an end. Griffith had always had ambitions to become a king, but he knew the virtuous path was an extremely long one. So he sold his body to Genon, who was known for having a preference for youthful males, and in exchange got funding that saw him end up on the other side during the 100-Year War. Genon, in the meantime, consolidated his power in Tudor and actually ended up becoming the person in charge of Doldrey, which meant he was fated to reunite with the love of his life. And yes, you heard that right, folks. Genon was in love with Griffith. We don't know what the White Falcon said or did to him in their brief time together, but it was clearly rather impactful because Genon's obsession with Griffith is what led to his downfall. When the band of the Falcon attacked Doldrey, Genon sent out most of his forces into the field and kept a token force to defend the fortress. This force was defeated by Casca and her unit, which then cut off retreat for the Tudor forces on the field. Even when they were being routed by the much smaller band of the Falcon, Genon insisted they keep fighting and bring Griffith to him, alive. Which, that last bit, is the delusional part for us in all of this. Eventually, he does end up reuniting with his love, but Griffith just coldly explains to him that he was nothing more than a used tool. And he couldn't have Genon's loose tongue prattle their secrets to the world. He stabbed Genon through his eye, and once again, this felt like vindication, until you stop and think about what Griffith really did over here. Earlier, in his association with Genon, Casca once caught him with the governor, and Griffith explained what he was doing bluntly to her the morning after. But as he explained his reasons, he clawed himself bloody, and Casca accepted them without even questioning Griffith's indifference to Genon's treatment of literal children. The fact that Griffith allowed Genon to use him like he used those other boys, and yet he claimed he was doing all this was his own fallen comrade should have been Casca's first red flag. But when you're in love, all reds look beautiful, and Casca found out the truth of that the hard way, as did Genon. King of Midland. From one disgusting paedophile to another, the King of Midland's fall from grace was one of the more shocking moments in Berserk, mostly because before that, he was one of the best noble characters in the series. The King of Midland is introduced in the series as something of a political maverick. He breaks with the traditional approach to warfare by hiring the Band of the Falcon as his primary military force, and ends up creating countless enemies at court. The king spoke the words of a wise king when he first appeared in the manga. He talks about putting his stock in the youth and wanting to put an end to the century-long war with Tudor for the betterment of his people. He showed astute judgment by relying on Griffith, who paid more dividends than the rest of his armies combined. But where he fell short was his own character, because despite being a wise monarch, the king harbored an extremely dark secret. He secretly lusted for his daughter. Charlotte, who looked a lot like her mother, was the apple of the king's eye, and over time, his affection for her crossed the boundaries of a parent-daughter relationship and turned into something malign. The king had rejected every offer for Charlotte's hand when Griffith joined his ranks, and kept doing so for the 3 years they worked together. He indulged all of Charlotte's wishes and never once showed a desire to part with her, when he could have ended the war by creating peace through marriage. When Griffith slept with Charlotte, the king had him not only imprisoned, but tortured beyond insanity. And the White Falcon only helped matters along by calling out the king's desire for his own daughter in the middle of being questioned by him. The king, having realized Charlotte had already been despoiled, decided to let go of his veil of sanity and try to assault her. When that failed and she cried out for Griffith, the king turned his entire wrath against the White Falcon. He had his torturer turn Griffith into a corpse-like shell of his former self, and when he was rescued, the king sent his elite Bakaraka assassins after them. When that failed, he sent the infamous Black Dog Knights, composed of cutthroat criminals, and the Apostle Wild after them. When Wild and his men didn't return either, the king dedicated 70% of his fighting forces to scouring the earth in search of Griffith, and aged 50 years in the process, though only 3 years had passed in truth. In his final moments as well, the king wasn't free of Griffith, as the White Falcon, now the prophetic Falcon of Light, appeared in his death dream and showed him how he was going to take Charlotte away from him forever. The king's death would have felt sympathetic had we not known his true nature, but because we do, we feel no remorse for the guy. He played the wise fool when it suited him and the mad tyrant when it didn't, and he failed at both. Godot. Let's move away from beacons of false wisdom to one that actually exemplifies what that world truly means. Godot is a master blacksmith who's the creator of the most iconic sword in the entire series, Guts' Dragon Slayer. He comes from a line of blacksmiths. and he claims that he had a hammer in his hand before he even learnt how to walk. Having spent his early life forging weapons for nobility and royalty, Godot grew tired of the aesthetic trappings of his work and desired to create something worthy of being called a weapon. When a king put out a proclamation for a sword that can butcher dragons, Godot took it upon himself to create a weapon as described. But because the end result was unwieldy for every human being on this planet that isn't built like Guts, Godot was chased out of the kingdom and settled in a mountain near an ore mine, which is where Guts found him. Initially, their relationship was restricted to Guts' peregrination. When the swordsman first came to Godot's hut, he was looking to isolate himself for training and managed to do so comfortably with a blacksmith on hand for repairs. But over time, Godot's ideologies rubbed off on Guts, and he started respecting the blacksmith as a mentor figure, even if he didn't say it out loud. Guts once asked Godot why he was a blacksmith, and Godot's answer made him realize that he too sees life in the sparks that his sword creates in battle, just how Godot is mesmerized by the sparks that fly off his forge. When Guts shows up to check on Casca after spending 2 years fighting monsters, Godot chastises him for his weapon upkeep and his overall disposition. Guts tries to fire back by telling him he didn't understand a damn thing about what he was going through, but Godot knew the single-minded pursuit of a thing all too well, and he could see the toll it was taking on his friend. Godot tells Guts he's akin to a drawn blade on a battlefield that's begun to crack. He chides Guts for talking of vengeance when he wasn't even strong enough to immerse himself in sorrow with those he considers to be irreplaceable. Does Guts really have a place to deride Rickett for Casca's escape when he cared about neither of them in his 2-year pursuit of bloodshed? Godot says no, and he's right. Even Guts realizes this later on as he ruminates on the Master's blacksmith's words and resolves to change his ways. Godot took on Rickett when he showed up out of nowhere after the eclipse and helped the boy hone his skills as an engineer. Over time, he came to trust Rickett enough to entrust his adopted daughter's life in his hands. Godot didn't find his peace and happiness. He made it with his own 2 hands, and he thinks he was too late anyway. He used the last ounce of strength left in his body to reforge Guts' sword and create new armor for him before he set off to look for Casca. Godot thinks to himself that the brash fool doesn't even acknowledge him as he departs, despite the fact that this could be the last time they meet, and so he leaves Guts a parting message: to not turn out like him. So far, Guts is doing his best to avoid that outcome, but we don't know how long that will last, now that he seems to have lost his self-conviction. Hopefully, he recalls his mentor and friend's words when we see him next, instead of reminiscing about his losses to Griffith, and actually gets up. Erica. The adopted daughter of Godot is one of the purest characters in Berserk, and they're rare to find as it is. Erica lived in a village that was destroyed by the 100-Year War when Godot found her. She lost her entire family and was bawling her eyes out, so the aging blacksmith took her on and raised her as his own. He'd go on to look back at that decision as one of the best things he did in his entire life. Being raised by a blacksmith, Erica learned how to do things by herself rather quickly. And the great thing about her is, she doesn't think of herself as not needing to do those things. Erica helps Godot mine, smith, cook, clean, sew up wounds, and do pretty much everything else around his house. She's taken to her adoptive father's profession like a glove to her hand, and has dreams of becoming a blacksmith herself when she grows up. When Guts shows up at Godot's hut the first time, Erica becomes his training part of sorts, and after Judo and Casca join the father-daughter duo, Erica feels the first vestiges of the family she lost once again. Of course, she still has naive and childish ideals given that she is, a child. When Guts first shows up to the house after being away for 2 years, Erica immediately thinks they'll all live together now that her family is complete again. When Casca escapes the ore mine, Erica blames herself and only finds peace when Puck cuddles up next to her, or is forced to do so, rather. When Erica learns that Casca is safe, she rejoices, and when she learns that her dreams of starting a new family won't likely come true anytime soon, she finds solace in the fact that at least she has Rickett beside her. Rickett and Erica have become very close in their time together, to the point they're like a brother-sister duo that knows exactly how to assist each other almost intuitively. Erica and Rickett survived Godot's death together, lived as blacksmiths on the border together, traveled to Falconia together, and then escaped it together as well. Their bond has allowed both of them to move past their traumas and find peace in a relationship neither of them saw coming. And Erica is a very helpful soul as well, as she assisted Daiba without knowing his reputation and established a bond with the usually aloof wizard. It'll be very interesting to see what role she plays going forward, because at this moment, Erica should be in Kushan country. That's where Rickett and his group escaped to from Falconia, and just imagining Erica fixing up Kushan armor at a makeshift forge would probably put a smile on Godot's face. This paragon of innocence and purity must be protected at all costs. Might as well turn out to be the salvation of Guts in the future. Slan. Conversely, this character has had her eyes fixated on the Black Swordsman since they first met, and you do not want to be introduced to her idea of a good time. Spoiler alert, it doesn't involve forging blades. Slann is the only female member of the God Hand, and that makes you wonder what kind of horrors she might have committed in her life to join that demonic sausage party. We know nothing of her previous life as a human, though we can safely say that she's been alive for centuries as a God Hand member. As an entity, Slann seems to be a representation of the obsessiveness of desire. She finds beauty in the ugliest of paradoxes, like life and death commingling in a single domain, or love and hate finding their place in a single act. She derives pleasure from pain, whether it's being inflicted upon her or in front of her. And yes, we do mean what you're thinking. Slann is usually the God Hand member explaining how a Behelit's user's deep desire for power and escape from their mortal fates culminates in them becoming apostles, or in the case of Crimson Behelit users, a God Hand. She also revels in the conflict of human emotions playing out in front of her, as evidenced by her description of Griffith's violation of Casca as a beautiful thing. Ever since she saw Guts struggling against the tide of causality during Griffith's eclipse, she's had her eyes on him. She wanted him when he met her again during the Black Swordsman arc, and she kept tabs on him all this time. Slann partially manifests in the physical world within the dark domain of Qliphoth when the physical and astral worlds start to merge, just to come see Guts. She wants him to join the ranks of demonkind, and encourages him to use his Behelit to gain the same power as Griffith. She slashes through his armor with one gesture of her hands, and hurts his astral body as well, which is a wound that can't be repaired easily, even with elf dust. Guts shoots her with his arm cannon, and she wants more. He runs her through with Dragon Slayer, and she calls him the best and kisses him. Slann is clearly obsessed with our protagonist, and this is one obsession he does not want to play with. Trust us. But these are just her personality traits. Slann's personality is a reflection of her own ideal self-image, but the powers she wields are granted to her by the idea of evil. As a God Hand member, Slann and the rest of her kinsmen exist only as profound astral entities, massive concentrations of evil thoughts and negative emotions that can't tangibly affect the physical world, but can definitely influence it with their immense spiritual powers. For instance, Slann paves the way for the incarnation ceremony by influencing heretics surrounding the region of St. Albion to adopt extreme beliefs, shall we say. As the goddess of the flames, she inspired a cult centered around the concept of rejecting all that was considered to be pure and human by the Holy See. Her cult followers had orgies like a Californian swinger party, took drugs like one too, but where things get really messed up is with their practice of cannibalism. Slann's cult engages in that act frequently, and ends up becoming one of the first sources of blood for the blood flow of the dead during the incarnation ceremony. In Qliphoth, she revealed that she can basically endlessly spawn ogres, trolls, and other dark astral entities so long as her manifestation holds, which is why Guts had to, well, you know, stick his sword inside her guts. Pun intended in the most literal of senses. She can view the flow of causality as a current, but seemingly can't make out the finer details of its stream, unlike Void, which is an interesting detail we expect to have consequences on the God Hand's grand plans. Currently, Slann has been manifested into the physical world completely as a consequence of the great roar of the astral world, and the last time we saw her was in amongst a swirling mass of limbs and contorting flesh. So far, Griffith has made no move to contact or connect with his kinsman, so it's difficult to predict what role Slann will play in the conflicts to come, but we can be sure of the fact that she'll be involved in them, considering she's one of 5 God Hand members, and leaving any of them alive would mean disaster for the physical world. Also, getting a satisfying conclusion to her mini-arc with Guts would be great for our mental health, because that interaction between them in Qliphoth haunts us till this day, for reasons you don't want to know. Conrad. From the most attractive member of the God Hand to the least attractive one, aesthetics is not something Conrad strives for. In fact, he doesn't even open his childlike mouth as much as the rest of his kinsmen do. The God Hand of Pestilence prefers to only chime in with short one-liners explaining the role that the invoker of a demonic ritual is expected to play. Like the other God Hand members, Conrad can see the flow of causality as well, which makes him nigh omniscient. He's at the very least better than Slann at interpreting causality's will, because she keeps insisting Guts join up with them, but he points out that the boy is not ordained by causality to join their kind. Besides, he already bears the brand of sacrifice, which makes him an offering, not a potential ally. Physique-wise, while he isn't the most striking of the bunch, Conrad's appearance is certainly the most unsettling. He looks like one of those plague-ridden babies from H.R. Giger's landscape paintings, has his hands clasped in a prayer position at all times, and shares his lower body with what looks like a woodlouse. Being the God Hand most associated with disease, Conrad is the one who engineers the outbreak of the plague in Midland. He does so by manipulating the rats of the physical world, possibly using dead spirits of the astral world as a a medium. Given that plague outbreaks are pretty frequent in the world of Berserk, we can assume that most of them were his fault. It's a bit of a stretch, but there's a possibility that Conrad had a hand in the death of Guts' adoptive mother, as she was taken away from him by the plague. Conrad also seemingly possesses the ability to create structures out of interstitial planes, as he's the one who erects the altar upon which Griffith is rebirthed. When he's manifested in the physical world following the Great Roar, his head appears in a tide of disease-carrying rats and skeletons. Currently, we don't know where he is or when we'll see him again in the story, but you can bet your ass we'll see him again, for the same reasons as we'll see Slann again, minus the Guts obsession. Ubik. Ah yes, the devil with the silver tongue, the most conniving man in the entire God Hand. Let's talk a bit about Ubik now. On the surface, he appears to be the least threatening God Hand member. Ubik is tiny in comparison to the rest of his kinsmen. His body is barely a fourth the size of Slann's, if you can even call it that. The upper half of Ubik's physique resembles that of a human, but the lower half makes him look like a flying octopus. Instead of legs, Ubik's got fin-like tentacles which he uses to maintain a constant state of levitation. His hands, much like Conrad's, are clasped together, and he also has a permanent grin plastered to his face. Most notably, Ubik's eyes are covered with a pair of glasses that seem to be fused to his head, and who doesn't trust a guy rocking sunglasses all the time? All of these factors make him look like the least intimidating member of the God Hand, but make no mistake, he's the one you need to be most careful of. Ubik is a master manipulator of the mind, and his role in the God Hand is to make their ritual targets forget that they have free will. The concept of causality feels all-encompassing and inescapable, but that's not exactly true. In fact, in the very first arc of Berserk, we saw causality being rejected by a character that had already submitted to it once, the Slug Count. The Count refused the God Hand's deal of becoming a twice reincarnated apostle because they wanted him to give up his daughter in exchange, and that was where he personally drew the line. Because of his rejection, he ended up in the Abyss, which is the ultimate fate of those whose lives entangle with demonkind. From this, we can infer that causality is more a guideline than a rule. It lays out a roadmap for a person, and usually, they end up following it down to the last mile marker, after which they end up fulfilling their fated role. Apart from this one instance, the offer is usually accepted by the invoker of the ritual, and Ubik is primarily the reason why. Being a master manipulator, Ubik has dominion over the mind, and uses this to coerce his targets into believing the worst aspects of their personalities are the truest ones. When using offers of power and escape from mortal pain doesn't work, Ubik casts a projection of his target's subconscious into the material realm of the interstice, and goes to work directly on the subconscious. Most of the time, he only provides commentary on the life decisions the target has made, and it's enough to convince them to take the deal. When that doesn't happen, Ubik can take up a role within the scene that's playing out and directly convince the target of their inherently evil nature. He shapes circumstances and life events in such a way that you'll end up thinking there's no way you were ever a good person, and becoming an apostle or a God Hand is your only calling in life. It's harrowing stuff, considering most apostles were fragile humans to begin with. Even the strongest of their kind have cracks in their emotional armors which they chose to fix with the power of evil, instead of accepting things for what they were. And this is where Ubik really shines. You can argue that without him, Griffith wouldn't have given in to the God Hand's tempting offer. Yet he ended up making the choices laid down in his preordained roadmap, thanks in no small part to Ubik. He makes sacrificing one's humanity and soul in exchange for power sound like a fun day at Disneyland, without mentioning that once that day is over, you'll end up in literal hell. And the fact that we never see him outside of demonic rituals in the series makes that much more secretive. There is an argument to be made that because he seems to have immense influence over the subconscious mind, Ubik is the one who convinced humanity that they were about to be saved by the Falcon of Light. It'd make sense considering his whole shtick is manipulating you into serving his god. On top of that, when we see Ubik's manifestation in chapter 307, we see him sitting inside of the tree man inspired by Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights triptych. That particular figure was found in the Hell section of the triptych, and considering Ubik is a Hellspawn, him sitting in the middle of the table inside the tree man is only fitting. What's curious is to note that the rest of the painting shows myriad anthropomorphic creatures moving in a single direction, and all of their designs seem to be associated with avian predators. This lines up perfectly with the Falcon of Darkness prophecy, where the blind white sheep and the bound black sheep would both end up being shepherded by the Falcon of Darkness. Ubik turning that into a prophetic dream of salvation for mankind would be like a parlor trick for him, and we suspect that's exactly what he did here as well. For the parts in the Revelations chapters where Griffith seemed to be directly involved, we'd say that he was like the King of Midland's death dream or Zod's subconscious defeat to the strongest. The rest, all Ubik. And that's why taking him out first should be any God Hand hunter's priority. Without him, recruitment for demons would fall drastically, and perhaps humanity wouldn't be led astray by subconscious desires ever again. Void. But if you're gonna go after the brains of an operation, you must take out its spine as well. And Void is the whole damn skeletal structure of this entity called the God Hand. He's the leader of the Quintumvirate of Evil, and it's evident in his behavior. Remember how we said Void has the most striking appearance of all the God Hand members a few minutes ago? Well, that's because he looks like he was tortured into accepting his current existence, which might have something to do with his backstory. If you followed any of our content on Berserk, then you'd know that Void is the priest that Supreme King Geyserich had imprisoned in the Tower of Conviction. He was jailed for his defiance of the king's edicts, and tortured to the point he looks like, well, this. Exposed brain, peeled back flesh exposing his skull, eyelids sewn shut, disturbing stuff. But throughout that torment, Void never stopped calling out the name of God, hoping for deliverance. And then one day, he got it. Void sank into the abyss and faced the idea of evil. The secrets of existence itself were whispered into its ear, and he emerged from that swirling nightmare as the first God Hand to ever exist. At least in the current cycle, because there's a possibility there was a God Hand before the current one. In order to achieve his new transient existence, Void sacrificed everyone in Geyserich's capital city, which ended up sinking to the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth. It's this capital that is restored as Falconia in the current timeline. If you want more proof that Void used to be this preacher from centuries ago, just look at the way he addresses the apostles gathered for Griffith's eclipse. He calls them the lambs of the unholy God born of man and welcomes them to the interstice for the sacred feast. He often uses religious terminology to explain the machinations of causality and the idea of evil itself, talking like an evil preacher, which, in this world, is a dead giveaway about your past life. Void's enmity with Skull Knight was made evident in the first face-to-face encounter. As soon as SK broke into Griffith's eclipse, his first move wasn't to save Guts or Casca, it was to take a swipe at Void. The Archangel of Demonkind deflected that attack back at Skull Knight flawlessly, and the two shared a cold stare before the latter galloped off to save his struggling counterpart. This enmity was all but confirmed in Chapter 362, where we learnt that Skull Knight's final human moments were spent in the presence of the Abyss and Void himself. This 1,000-year-long rivalry forms the basis for Berserk, and parallels the one shared by Guts and Griffith. Every God Hand member can see the flow of causality to a certain extent, but Void is the only one who can apparently predict even the unpredictable. He wasn't surprised by Guts' resistance to Griffith's powers in the least bit during the Black Swordsman arc, and he makes no attempt to stop the Skull Knight from escaping with Guts and Casca during the eclipse, something Slan calls him out for having foreseen in the anime, unlike herself and the rest of the God Hand. Void is also the only person who can directly turn a human being into a demon, because while the rest of the God Hand contributes to manipulating the target into making that choice, Void is the only one who can make it happen. This is because he's the only God Hand member that can perform the Invocation of Doom, the process through which a victim of a ritual is seared with the brand of sacrifice. Once Void sends out this brand, the ascension of the Invoker is pretty much guaranteed, and he can sense the Invoker's inclinations just as well as Ubik while he's doing this, if not better. During Griffith's eclipse, Ubik tried to remind Griffith that he was a killer and conqueror from the beginning, but it didn't quite manage to convince him fully. What did the job was Void projecting an image of the castle from Griffith's childhood, and him compelling Griffith to reach out and grasp his dream, no matter the cost. Void knew he needed Griffith to become Femto, so he stepped in directly. When trying to get the Slug Count to give up his daughter and reincarnate twice, Void simply cancels the Invocation of Doom once he senses the Count's change of heart, probably because he knew a certain Kushan Emperor would do just as well for his purposes. If Guts' story ends with him facing off against Griffith, then Skull Knight's will end with him finally defeating Void. But the question is, how? Void is the catalyst of most things evil in Berserk. Considering his position in the pecking order of Demonkind, his spatial powers already far surpass Femto's, and he's only used them once. Where Femto can only manipulate the space around him, Void can create spatial distortions and open up portals that can redirect an enemy's weapon on themselves, like he did with Skull Knight. This, coupled with the fact that he can see things that even his kinsmen can't, already make him a dangerous threat. Now, tack onto that the fact that these are the only abilities we've seen him use, and you start to dread what else he might be capable of. Void could hold the key to defeating the entire God Hand, and understanding their nature as well as the truth of Berserk's history. But that's going to be an order taller than the Tower of Conviction itself, and that's if he can even be cornered in the first place. Sylar. He was introduced as an ignorant foreign fighter, too big for his own britches. But since that tournament defeat to Guts in Chapter 41 of Berserk, Sylar has come a long way. The prince and young master of the Bakiraka clan, Sylar has immense pride in his heritage, and it was on full display in his first appearance. Using his Eastern weapons and exotic fighting style, Sylar was a proper anime B-villain upon his introduction. He was calling out Western training and fighting methods during an arms tournament while embarrassing its practitioners. Then Guts shows up, defeats him with ease, and likens him to a circus performer. Sylar decides to redeem his lost honor by leading a raid on the fugitive band of the Falcon, but he's met once again by Guts, who shocks him with his actual battle acumen. In their first fight, Sylar only used his katars and his natural agility to fight Guts. During their second encounter, he used the katar, projectile weapons called chakram and a special 10-bladed sword called an urumi to fight against Guts. He was left dumbfounded by the future Black Swordsman's practical yet borderline suicidal counters to each one of those weapons. Guts humbled Silat to the point he went back to training again, and when he reappeared in the story, he knew better than to engage his adversary head-on, even with 4 powerful escorts. But at the time of his reappearance, the purpose of Silat's character had also changed. See? Initially, Miura only brought in Silat and the Bakuraka clan as exotic side characters to ramp up the tension of the Golden Age arc's final stages. But as the story progressed, he integrated the 2 separate entities into a broader cultural identity and gave them a backstory more tragic than any other noble houses, even House Alkvist. Centuries ago, the Bakuraka clan, a warrior slave clan in service to the then-ruling Kushan dynasty, was driven out of their homes by the current holders of the throne. They migrated westward and erected an impregnable fortress as a holding station until they figured out their next move. When they realized going back home was going to be next to impossible, they gave up their pride as warriors and turned to assassination as a means of sustaining themselves. For decades, the Bakuraka clan worked alongside Western nobility to destabilize kingdoms, all for their own survival. It's said that the 100-Year War was stretched out that long only because the Bakuraka managed to kill over 100 key political figures that might have brokered a peace. The life of a Bakuraka exile was dedicated to learning the art of killing, and it's this tortured legacy that Silat now carries on his shoulders. When Guts humbled him, he returned to home base and retrained himself, vowing never to let his arrogance get the better of him again. And to realize his clan's collective dream of returning to their homeland, he struck a deal with the Kushan Emperor, Ganishka. Silat and his Bakuraka were assigned to capture the Falcon of Oracle, aka the incarnated Griffith. To this effort, the young master of the Bakuraka sent out countless scouts from his clan and personally surveyed battlefields alongside his Fort Tapasa, heavily built warriors who used the secrets of yoga to obtain bodies that can smash through plate armor. When Silat sees Guts during the initial stages of the Kushan invasion of Midland, he lets him be because his goals are different. Besides, he knows what Guts is capable of, so he focuses on capturing the Falcon of Light. All the while, he endures all kinds of abuse and derision from mainland Kushan commanders who abhor his clan's history. Silat doesn't care about insults. His deepest wish is to see his people return home. This is why he even accepts a demotion when he fails to capture Griffith in St. Albion, because in the end, the big picture is what concerns him. But as he sees the course of the Kushan-Midland War play out, he begins questioning its purpose and his own place in it. Silat discovers the inhuman identity of Emperor Ganishka and Griffith and gets existential about the new world to come. When Laban leads Wyndham's citizens out of the city in the guise of Kushan soldiers, Silat intercepts them and sees through them instantly, but he lets them pass because of his disillusion with the world. He tells Jarif, a Kushan turncoat that tries to convince him to join Griffith, that he understands why he and many other defectors would do so, but he himself would like to decide his own fate. And though he'd considered pledging fealty to Griffith, he ultimately decides against it. This is because Silat would rather die and see his clan in permanent exile rather than serve an inhuman leader again. So he takes it upon himself to find a way to deal with Griffith. By this point, he knows Griffith is no benevolent ruler, and he definitely knows he's far from human. Silat witnessed the interaction between Griffith and Ganishka in the latter's mobile palace after all. He's the thief that we mentioned Sir Owen had to take care of earlier in the video, but he wasn't in the Falcon's castle to steal anything. He was there to figure out the Falcon's weaknesses, if any existed in the first place. And find it he did, when he saw Rickett slapping Griffith. Silat realized that Rickett knew something about Griffith that no one else did, and figured the kid was the key to ending the Mad Falcon's reign. So he helps Rickett, Erica, and Daiba, a Kushan sorcerer, escape Falconia and arrive at the hidden Bakuraka village. From there, they relocate to Kushan homeland, and we can say this because that's where they're taking Guts to as we speak. That's right, folks, the Kushan slavers that attacked the vessel Guts and Co. are currently sailing on in the manga turn out to be Silat's Bakuraka. They, alongside Daiba and Rickett, extract our crew from the ocean and take them to the Kushan capital. From the way things are shaping up, Silat is most likely going to be a general in the final battle, and that's just as well. Reclaiming his clan's honor by slaying Inhumans is far more suited to Silat's taste than bringing them home whilst serving one. Serpico, one of the best boys of the entire franchise, and a total package if we've ever seen one. Serpico was likely created by Miura for fan service. After all, he actively stated in interviews that he thought Serpico was the kind of guy girls would fall head over heels for. And to a certain extent, he isn't wrong. Serpi is quite handsome, we must admit. But then he went and gave him such a heartbreaking backstory and purpose that now we can't see him as anything but a great ally to have in your squad. Serpico was born the illegitimate son of the Western world's richest man, Federico de Vendimian. Lord Federico had an affair with Serpico's mother and then abandoned her as soon as he learnt she was pregnant, which was typical of nobility at the time. Serpico grew up in abject poverty. His mother was a maid, so she didn't earn a lot as it is, and after being cast away by the love of her life, she became demented and emaciated. She was so thin that you could see the bones through her skin, but that didn't stop her from drilling discipline into her child. Serpico's mother wanted her son to be recognized for his noble blood, and so she pushed him to do things he didn't want to do. Serpico took care of her, studied, and did everything in between all by himself. And yet every time he got bullied by someone and didn't stand up for himself, his mother would deride him as if he were a disobedient cur. Eventually, Serpico came to despise her, so when he was saved by a noblewoman one snowy night after getting beaten up and offered a job at her mansion, he thought good riddance. But turns out that noblewoman was his father's full-blooded daughter, and Serpico learnt that fact many months into her service. Even after meeting the only son who could have actually made him proud as a father, Federico told Serpico to keep his identity a secret in exchange for peerage and a lifetime of comfort, and Serpico accepted. He stayed on as his half-sister's page, champion and punching bag, all without thinking of home even once. Even when his sister nearly compromised their dynamic with her feelings, his own integrity didn't allow him to let anything happen. When Federico made his sister join the Holy Iron Chain Knights, Serpico went with her and became the organization's Herald of Arms. He had no particular religious inclinations. He was just happy to be serving a family member that actually wanted him around. But when his own mother was one day put on trial for being a heretic, Serpico's faith was shaken. He nearly broke down and got himself killed by revealing he was related to her, and then his half-sister made him choose between herself and his mother. Serpico knew his mum's mind was gone, but he felt guilty all the same. He abandoned her. He allowed things to get to this point. So he went through with the execution and decided to do everything in his power to keep his sister safe and happy. This is why, when Guts enters their life, he immediately wants to kill the guy. He can't stand the uncertainty he inspires in his sister. It takes a long time and a duel on his own terms for Serpico to trust Guts again, but once they get over their personal hostilities, they turn out to be fluid battle partners. With his mastery of the rapier, Serpico is a highly accurate swordsman whose capabilities are enhanced with the use of the Sylph Sword and Cloak. These weapons, imbued with the power of wind elements, allow Serpico to slash through astral creatures and use a dynamic range of maneuvers, considering he can now fly. His most impressive fight till date has been the one he has with Daiba, where he fights alongside Guts and manages to hold his own, something very few people can claim to have done. At this point in the tale, Serpico trusts Guts as the boss of their crew, and is usually the one keeping a rational outlook on things. Given that he can pretty much do everything, he also serves as the group's cook, cleaner, maintenance, you name it. But there's still one thing that Serpico is wary of when it comes to Guts, and that's his use of the Berserker armor. As the Herald of Arms, Serpico is intimately aware of all sorts of worldly knowledge. He's memorized the heraldry of thousands of houses, so this shouldn't surprise you at all. Serpico is also familiar with stories of Berserker warriors, which is exactly what Guts becomes when he uses the Berserker armor in full effect. At least twice, Serpico has had to square up to a Berserk Guts in an attempt to protect their friends. And while Guts promised to hold back after reconciling with him, the way he is right now in the story, we hate to admit it, but Serpi's fears might come true sometime soon. Serpico is an exceptionally perceptive and adaptable character, but if Guts' actions endanger his sister's life, he won't hesitate to go on a rampage. And trust us when we say, that would be far more terrifying than you can imagine him being capable of just looking at his pretty face. Farnace, where her half-brother grew up in abject poverty, Farnace de Vandymian had every luxury in the world available to her. She was the youngest child and the only daughter of the richest family in the West. Her every whim was fulfilled within minutes, and there was nothing she could have ever felt a lack of in her life, at least from a materialistic standpoint. What created a gaping hole in Farnace's heart was the utter neglect with which her family treated her. Her parents and siblings were never around to spend time with her or just talk to her like regular family members. Her father was too busy consolidating power, her mother was too busy partying, and her brothers were busy doing one of those things or the other. She lived in a huge mansion with dozens of servants, but Farnace de Vandymian always felt alone. It didn't help that even when her family was around, they were too self-absorbed to be considerate of her feelings. Once they went on a vacation and her dad bought her a toy. Farnace practically worshipped that toy as her most cherished keepsake, but then later on in her life, her dad told her to burn the toy for it to become hideous and worn, not knowing of the significance it had for Farnie. And being the daughter that she was, Farnace didn't rebel. She just silently accepted it. The only thing that kept her sane was her belief that in order to overcome fear, you must become one with it itself, which led her to the path of religious fanaticism. Farnace was a little girl when she partook in her first public burning of a heretic. The sensation of being praised by the people for doing what was perceived as the right thing was addictive to her. Over the years, she found herself getting more and more entrenched in the enforcement of her prescribed faith. When Farnace was a young girl, she found Serpico on the streets of Ritanis and took him home. She nursed him back to health personally and made him her personal attendant as repayment of her kindness. In truth, Farnace had driven away most of her attendants with her erratic behavior, but she figured if Serpico owed her his life, he'd stick with her longer. She was completely unaware of the fact that they were related, which is Serpi's primary motivation to protect Farnace, and that's why she eventually caught feelings for him. Baroness could see Serpico was just as alone as her, and thought that they could run away together and make each other whole. But Serpico had known for years that their shared loneliness was a familial issue, not a romantic one. When he rejected her advances, she withdrew to her cold former self and doubled down on hunting heretics. Eventually, Baroness became the commander of the Holy Iron Chain Knights, a mostly ceremonial force, but with the eclipse taking place, it was mobilized by the Miracle Recognition Department. Baroness is introduced in Chapter 95, recalling the prophecy of the Falcon and thinking that it applies to the Black Swordsman they keep hearing reports about, aka Guts. She manages to capture him against all odds, but after experiencing the full force of his Night of Terrors, Baroness starts questioning her own faith. By the time the incarnation ceremony is over, she realizes that her pyrophilia and religious fanaticism was nothing more than a rejection of facing her own truth. So she secularizes herself, becomes a part of Guts' traveling party, and completely reforms herself. Baroness discovers that she's a prodigious mage, and by acting as the now childlike Casca's protector, she finds purpose in life greater than herself. For the first time, she feels useful, and it's all thanks to Guts, whom she also starts liking. While there was a brief moment when Baroness considered returning to her old life when her party reached Britannis, after seeing just how much her friends cared for her, she decided she was going to allow herself to enjoy her life. At the moment, she's capable of manipulating thorn snakes, casting the formation of the Four with ease, and can also use odd manipulation to perform healing magic, an essential skill for a group that always finds itself in trouble. Baroness's feelings for Guts are quiet as of now, but she knows his dynamic with Casca and has acted out on her companion at least on one occasion because of it. Though she was the one who saved Casca from her broken mind by walking through that perilous journey in the Corridor of Dreams, expect her emotions toward Guts to cause a scene at some point in the story. She also doesn't know that she's related to Serpico even this far deep into the story, so you can expect that revelation to have a severe impact on her psyche as well. As for Baroness overall, as long as she doesn't try to burn us to death, we're cool with her doing magic and stuff. Just know that if you see her holding a lit torch with a glimmer in her eyes, you should probably run away as quickly as you can. Azan. This is one character that we frankly didn't expect to survive beyond the conviction arc, but through some divine miracle, he has. And what's more, he now finds himself attached to Guts' traveling party by some twist of fate. Introduced as the virtuous vice commander of the Holy Iron Chain Knights, Azan used to be a knight with a fearsome reputation in his youth. One time, Azan reached a bridge and saw an old man trying to cross it. He offered to help the man whilst fending off 100 horsemen from his enemy nation, and in the end they managed to cross thanks to Azan's bravery. From that day forward, he was known as the legendary Bridge Knight, and we call him legendary because even Guts knows of his moniker and accomplishments. Azan is an extremely dutiful and chivalrous man, who's quite possibly the only true representation of knighthood in the series. Even when he's on a quest to confirm a literal Revelations-level prophecy for his faith, he prioritizes saving civilians first. Azan doesn't believe in treating prisoners with indecency, and considers any person who tries to kill a defeated man worse than scum. He places great value in his comrades' lives, even though he knows that they're nothing more than inexperienced pretty boys, and does his best to train them however he can. And despite his old age and stout frame, the guy can still freaking go. Guts was heavily injured and bleeding out when he first encountered Azan. Even in that condition, he was clowning on the Holy Iron Chain Knights and would have managed to escape them too. But when Azan stepped in and peppered him with a barrage from his staff, Guts knew that this guy was still the real deal, and chose to take Farnese hostage instead of continuing the fight. Later, though it only happened because of his giant staff, Azan survived the destruction of the Tower of Conviction and being crushed by debris, only to wake up and get right back at protecting the innocent in his vicinity. Up until then, he was one of the few people who managed to hold back the blood flow of the dead long enough to survive the incarnation ceremony, and afterward, he held off a Kushan invading force with his makeshift team of fighters long enough for all of them to escape. Following Farnese and Serpico's resignation from the Holy Iron Chain Knights, Azan returned to the Holy See with a report of everything he'd seen and was excommunicated for it. He ended up becoming a nomadic miser, living in random boats on the dock and donning a helmet with a large mustache at all times to avoid feeling shame at his dismissal. He only got attached to the Black Swordsman party out of luck, when Isidro stumbled across him while fighting Captain Bonebeard, or maybe this too was fated, giving causality's nature. After ducking questions about who he was, though everyone had figured out his identity, Azan joined the Black Swordsman party on their quest to Elfhelm, and began training Isidro as a swordsman aboard the Seahorse. He survived a battle with the Sea God, where he held his ground against the malign deity's alive tentacles. Currently, he's being taken to Kushan lands, alongside the rest of the ship's crew, where we're sure we'll get an answer for his survival as well. Remember that despite being a comedic relief right now, Azan is actually one of the most skilled fighters and dutiful knights in all of Berserk. He'll sacrifice himself in an instant if it meant he could die basking in the glory of chivalry, and we expect that's exactly what will happen to him. Luca. one of the top 3 best girls of Berserk easily. We fell in love with Luca the moment we met her. And no, not because of what she does, you filthy animals. Get your minds out of a tent. Introduced toward the end of Chapter 132, where she comes across and helps a lost Casca, it's clear from the beginning that Luca is big on helping those in need. She was going to St. Albion because of the kingdom-wide spread of plague, and knew that in order to survive unsavory living conditions, she'd have to do unsavory things. Together with 4 other girls, Pepe, Fuse, Lucy, and Nina, Luca runs a clandestine brothel in the refugee camps of St. Albion, which is risky enough in itself given the holy nature of the city. Just because members of the Holy Iron Chain Knights partook in her services, prostitution wasn't about to be legalized and, if found, Luca and her girls could very well end up at the stake. But Luca is as street smart as she is cheerful and optimistic. She makes sure that she shares all her earnings with not just her girls, but their neighbors as well, so they wouldn't rat her out. Luca has contacts that end up becoming useful to Guts both inside and outside the Tower of Conviction. And she truly acts like a mother figure towards all her girls, including Casca. She looks after and cares for one of Berserk's universally hated characters, Nina, even after she berates Luca and joins a murderous sex cult. You literally can't ask for a better girl in your life. Heck, even her regular customer Jerome knows how good Luca is, though she had to break his heart because Luca ain't nobody's mistress. Thank you very much. One of her defining character traits is her fearlessness even in the face of death, as she thinks that she can't be like those she looks down on, even if she relates with them. Before the blood flow of the dead begins, Luca survives falling from the massive Tower of Conviction, thanks to Skull Knight, and thinks that she's dead at first and he's the Grim Reaper. When she realizes she's alive, she rushes straight back to the tower to look for her girls and actively helps Nina survive the night. In the middle, she's briefly abducted by the apostle responsible for the incarnation ceremony, and after hearing his life story as a human, Nina decides to fulfill his true heart's desire and acknowledge his life following his demise. Luca knows that she has a tendency to not accept her own flaws, but something tells us causality is driving this girl's feet forward. Why else would she have been in Falconia by the time Rickett and Erica arrived in the city? Though Luca is completely unaware of their shared connection to Guts, she knows what it's like to have a friend that you thought was something else and actually helps Rickett escape Falconia at the risk of Griffith finding out. Luca's empathy, connections, and organizational skills, and the fact that she lives in and controls a facility in the enemy's camp could end up becoming useful assets to the Black Swordsman Party someday. And we personally would hate it if a story just ended without her having some sort of significant impact on the endgame scenario. Although, to be honest, we think that's the reason the incarnation ceremony went, slightly off the rails. And if that's true, then she's already done plenty. Father Mosgus. You don't know what true religious fanaticism looks like until you've seen the stone-smooth face of Father Mosgus, aka the Bloody Inquisitor. The Holy See is a notoriously extremist faith. It has no qualms with reinforcing its monotheistic beliefs with public acts of violence against non-believers and heretics. But Mosgus takes this obsession with living life by scripture to an extreme level. We don't know where Father Mosgus comes from, how he came to be a part of the church, or why he was appointed as an inquisitor. What we do know is that he takes his job very seriously and has the highest conviction rate in the entire Holy See, which sounds good on paper. But it's as good as saying he pretty much punished both innocents and the guilty. Wherever Mosgus went, everyone got tense and nervous because to him, the only right way to worship God was the way he saw it fit. And his form of worship was extreme. Mosgus performs prostration on a daily basis, twice a day. Now, prostration is the act of falling on your knees and bowing your head to an entity that's bigger than you, like God. For the past decade, Mosgus has been doing his prostration so hard that his knees no longer allow him to walk. The reason his face appears so smooth is because he's literally flattened it out by slamming it on the ground over and over again. Mosgus interprets the Holy See scriptures in the most extreme fashion and considers torture to be a part of his sacred duty, not the perverse obsession that it clearly is for him. He once told Farnace that even though he disliked what his duty brought to his targets, for pain and suffering is something no man should go through, he'd still continue to do it without guilt because it was God's will. To illustrate his point, he tells her a story about an old woman who would help ease the deaths of dying people, and a man she encountered on the street one day. Until she met that man, the woman had sent a lot of people on their way to the afterlife by tending to them and comforting them. But when she tried to do the same for this man, she was rejected, because to him, his suffering was evidence that he'd lived life. Even though he was rotting, he rejected help, and that's the kind of rigid adherence to faith that Mosgus inspires in his followers. This is why, when she was working under him, Farnace got extra zealous with her pursuit of heretics, because she found comfort in Mosgus's ideology. Of course, all of it is just fanatical nonsense, and Farney ends up secularizing herself shortly after the conviction arc, but it shows you just the kind of effect a mad preacher can have on a willing listener. On his journeys, Mozgus picked up 5 malformed and shunned members of society, whom he then fashioned into his personal entourage of torturers. He gave them purpose by telling them God created them for a reason, but given that that reason according to him was torturing suspected heretics, we don't know if being saved was a blessing or a curse. Although we should note that Mozgus's disciples see him as their messiah and would die for him in the blink of an eye. And he too seems to genuinely care for them, as he's anguished by his disciples' deaths at the hands of Guts and co. For all of his claims about understanding the true nature of his gospel, Mozgus died the death of a blind fool. He foolishly thought that he and his disciples being turned into pseudo-apostles was a divine miracle, when in reality they were just being used to further progress the incarnation ceremony. Mozgus gave all of his attacks stupid names like God's Breath and God's Thousand-Arm Cannon, but he genuinely believed he got his power boost from God himself, so we can't really blame him, we guess. Despite sounding stupid, these attacks were lethal, and it took Guts all of his might and assistance from his crew to defeat Mozgus. God's breath refers to Mozgus's ability to breathe fire from his mouth, and he used this power to incinerate cinders and dead spirits alike in the short time he had it. The Bloody Inquisitor could sprout wings to fly, as could his disciples, and after seeing the latter fall at Guts' hands, Mozgus entered his released state, which gave Guts one of his toughest fights in the series. In this state, Mozgus spawns indestructible armor, shaped like feathers, and his wings transmute into massive hands. With these hands, he can unleash a 1,000-punch barrage in rapid succession, and also fly, which might as well be cheating, if you ask us. Guts only manages to defeat him thanks to a small chink in his armor, which he exploits to carve Mozgus open and throw him to his death. Despite being defeated, Mozgus dies at peace, thinking he was going to meet God, when in reality, he was headed for hell. His actions even before his transformation greatly accelerated the incarnation ceremony, but Miura managed to give the Bloody Inquisitor something of a silver lining later on in the series. When Pharnace enters the Corridor of Dreams, we see Mozgus appear as a washing stone in her subconscious, where he commends Pharnace for her faith and dedication. Pharnace replies that she's only doing her duty, and when she tries to wash Guts, a fight breaks out between him and Washstone Mozgus. She goes on to use her former mentor as a weapon whilst on a quest to save Casca's sanity, and this shows us that despite his horrendous nature, Mozgus ended up inspiring Pharnace in a positive manner. His memory becomes the bedrock of her new faith, which lies in the arcane, and as blasphemous as that would have been to him, we're just happy to see something positive come out of Mozgus's bloody past. Isidro. When you have a name that literally describes the 2 best skills in your arsenal, it kind of forces you to move away from those things and forge a new identity for yourself. The name Isidro is a combination of 2 Japanese words, which mean stone, ishi, and thief, dorobo. It's fitting for Isidro because he's a delinquent thief and also an expert marksman when it comes to stone throwing. In fact, his aim is so good he can shotgun birds out of the sky mid-flight, which is a really advanced skill for someone his age. But as we mentioned a moment ago, sometimes when you have a name that describes what you're good at, you want to move away from it and make your own identity. And that's the journey that Isidro's character takes. As a young boy, Isidro lived in a small village but had big dreams. He wanted to become a soldier of great repute, or at least a renowned mercenary warrior. This is because, growing up in Midland toward the final years of the 100-Year War, Isidro heard all kinds of tales of valor from the battlefield. But the one that inspired him was the tale of the 100-Man Slayer, the former raider captain of the undefeated Band of the Falcon, who slew 100 Tudorites in a single night. It's beyond comical that despite spending most of his screen time right beside his idol, Isidro still doesn't know Guts is the man he's been idolizing all his life. But despite his goofy nature, Isidro has the skills to survive in a war-torn Midland crawling with bandits and Kushan invaders. His introduction scene shows us his skill at thievery and deception, as he manages to trick a group of bandits into leaving him be by giving them rotten food supplies and keeping the fresh stuff for himself. When the bandits' buddies return, he pretends that Kushan were attacking them, and to his surprise, that's exactly what ended up happening. Isidro was backed into a corner, but he ended up being saved by Guts, which is how they first met. Ever since he saw Guts fight with Dragon Slayer, Isidro became determined to become his apprentice. And he went to great lengths to gain that honor. During the Conviction arc, Isidro became one of the MVPs of Berserk. He not only bought Puck time to bring Guts to the Heretic's Cave by turning into a rock-launching machine gun, he also helped Casca and Nina escape down a very steep cliff, using himself as leverage. When the former was tied to a stake to be burnt, Isidro literally jumped in to save the day. He helped Guts survive his fight with Moggus by teaming up with Puck to take out the twin disciples, and after spending days tracking him down following the Tower of Conviction's collapse, Isidro finally convinced Guts to let him join the swordsman and train the boy along his journey. As a fighter, Isidro has all the skills to hold his own against far more experienced opponents like the pirate Bonebeard, the nobleman Mule Wolfflame, and even Sir Azan. Thanks to Guts' teachings, he's found his own fighting style, which exploits his short frame and quick movement speed to deliver devastating slash damage to his opponents. With the fire-conducting Salamander Dagger and Guts' explosive bombs, he's a not-so-insignificant threat for any astral creature. But where Isidro falters in his pursuit of greatness is his willingness to take another human's life. While Isidro can certainly keep up with skilled swordsmen, he lacks killing intent, and it's thrown him off game at a couple of crucial moments in the manga. The young man dislikes this fact as much as his enemies do, and whenever Isidro fails at accomplishing an objective, he becomes his own greatest detractor. He has a strong bond and friendship with Puck, as the pair can often be seen goofing around with the rest of the cast, breaking the highly tense nature of Berserk by injecting it with some humor. But some fans find this pairing annoying, mostly because Isidro hasn't had much character development since his introduction. Well, we say that, but it looks like he's due for change really soon. After the fall of Elfhelm and the disappearance of his potential love interest with it, Isidro has taken on a much more broody attitude. He's internally berating himself for not being useful enough when the island was destroyed, not being able to save Isma from disappearing with it, and not even being powerful enough to help his comrades plan their next move. When Serpico finds him in chapter 373, he brushes off Shirki's ritual like he usually brushes off the young witch's actions, but you can see that this isn't him teasing her. Isidro genuinely doesn't care. When Silat's Kushan start boarding the seahorse, we see a drastic shift in Isidro's no-kill policy, as he doesn't hesitate to turn some of the Kushan into chum for sharks. The last time we saw him, he had a complete breakdown at seeing his idol and mentor not even lift a finger against his captives. Isidro is going through a crisis of faith right now, and it can only result in one of two things. Either he gives up on his journey, or he doubles down and gets over his hesitation to kill altogether, finally getting serious about things. Something tells us it's going to be the latter, and when that happens, that's when things will really get interesting with his character. Egg of the perfect world. Imagine living in a world where no one acknowledges your existence. Even when they do, they treat you like an animal because you haven't been taught what humanity is and vilify you for behaving like the thing they see you as. Imagine sustaining yourself on refuse, living inside the hollows of trees for years without anyone even making an attempt to seek you out. Imagine being nobody, having nothing to call your own, not even a name. What would that make you feel about the world? Wouldn't you hate it for rejecting you for doing nothing wrong? Wouldn't you want to do something to the people who treated you like an animal? Wouldn't you want to change the world itself? Well, that's the opportunity that was afforded to the nobody that became the egg of the perfect world, and he jumped on it the first chance he got. Having grown up in the shadow of the Tower of Conviction, the egg saw firsthand just how cruel even the grace of God was in his world. His existence itself was reviled by those who lived in St. Albion, and as far as anyone else was concerned, he didn't even exist. It didn't take long for the humans occupying the tower to turn his home into a grave hole for dead bodies. As he was being suffocated to death by corpses, nobody's rejection of the existing world order and deep desire to create a new one activated the Behelit in his possession and turned him into an apostle that looks just like a Behelit. Unlike other apostles who sacrificed their loved ones or those who defined their humanity, the egg of the perfect world sacrificed the world itself. This gave him the form of a Behelit and his tongue a brand of sacrifice, as he became the very vessel that would realize his ultimate dream. The egg of the perfect world manipulated events so that St. Albion would descend into utter chaos and reach a spiritual critical mass point, allowing him to trigger the incarnation ceremony. He created pseudo-apostles like the Great Goat and Mosgus from earlier in our list to accelerate the process. When both Guts and Casca entered St. Albion, the egg smiled because he knew the time for the new world to emerge had arrived. But what he didn't know was that things weren't going to go as smoothly as he'd thought. After turning Mosgus into his doomsday angel, the egg of the perfect world was going to wait at his lair beneath St. Albion as the city was consumed by the blood flow of the dead. Instead, he was confronted by the Skull Knight, who managed to mortally wound him. The foe of the Inhumans thought he couldn't kill the apostle outright because of a hesitation in his blade caused by causality. But as it turns out, it was likely the apostle's will to be acknowledged once in his life that allowed him to survive. The egg took Luca, who had just been saved by Skull Knight, and told her his entire life story out of the realization that he wanted someone to acknowledge the pain of his past. After observing the dedication that Mosgus' disciples displayed for their master, the egg wondered if things would have been similar for him had the Bloody Inquisitor found him in his youth. The egg of the perfect world clearly doubted himself at the last possible moment, but he committed himself to birthing the new world anyway. However, he didn't do this without straying off the path just a little bit. As he was climbing to his seat atop the Tower of Conviction, the egg came across the dying demon child of Guts and Casca and swallowed it out of compassion. When the blood flow of the dead and all the souls it carried surged into the egg's body, it activated like a Behelit and transformed the child's body into a physical incarnation of the god hand Femto, who took on his previous human appearance of Griffith. The reason the egg had a brand of sacrifice on its tongue despite being an apostle was because he was going to sacrifice his own flesh in exchange for bringing a god hand member into the world. But the original plans didn't include a dying demon child as an incubational entity. The egg of the perfect world made an executive decision that ended up having dire consequences for the person he was always meant to bring into the real world, and this moment of humanity is what leaves his imagined new world vulnerable to collapse. Though the egg was only in the story for a single arc, his actions have had lasting consequences on the lives of every character in the series, whether they know it or not. And that's the real bitter irony of his life story for us, that nobody got what he wanted and changed the world. But there was only one person to mourn what got him to this point, and no one to recognize his accomplishments after the fact. Locus, another apostle, although far more conventional than the one we just mentioned above. Sir Locus the Moonlight feels like a character that shouldn't be an apostle. A legendary knight of Midland who was undefeated as a jouster back in his day, Sir Locus was renowned for being on an eternal peregrination. This means that he would only serve a master as long as he was training himself under them, and then move on to the next one, never quite committing himself to a single higher authority. While this makes him sound like a wandering ronin without a purpose, the truth is quite different. In reality, Sir Locus likely didn't consider any of the lords or kings of his time worthy of his services, which is why he accepted the God-Hand's offer to become an apostle. See, becoming an apostle isn't exactly about whether you're evil or not, it's about the lengths you're willing to go to in exchange for power. Every person harbors the capacity to do great things, and conversely, every person can commit great evils as well. It's all about the lines you're willing to cross to see your dream come to life. And Locus, judging by his reverence of Griffith, always wished for a ruler that truly embodied the concept of the divine right of kings. This concept states that most monarchs draw their authority from religious doctrine, being ordained, as it were, to rule over and govern the adherents of the faith. But hardly any ruler followed this moral obligation as a life rule, and none of them seemed to care about revolutionizing society to make it work more efficiently. Most rulers in Berserk are either self-preservative or evil, sometimes both, and Locus wanted to serve the ideal king. He never came across such a ruler in his first life, but in his second one as an apostle, Locus has finally found his ideal king in Griffith. To call him divinely ordained would be an understatement, because Griffith is akin to a reflection of godhood itself in the series at this point. Not only has he managed to unite all of humanity in the name of a common cause, he's reconciled their spiritual differences with his mass soul-liberating ceremonies, and he's even given monsters like Locus himself a place in the world. Apostles are inherently repulsive to humans because of their nature. They're vile beings who thirst for bloodshed and violence. They're inhumans, and yet Griffith has given them a purpose beyond mindless slaughter and used his very godhood to keep them in line. For Locus, Griffith's decisive dystopia is an incisive utopia, and he'll do all he can to preserve it. The Moonlight Knight is one of the strongest apostles in Griffith's service. As the commander of the War Demon's Lancer unit, Locus and his men are usually on the front lines of every conflict. When he transforms into his released state, the Moonlight Knight resembles an armored centaur with an ever-elongating lance attached to his arms. He uses this lance to skewer through scores of enemies with a single thrust. Locus is so committed to Griffith as a soldier that when he faces the Kushan Emperor, who announces his intent to desecrate the God-Hand despite being an apostle himself, Locus becomes irate. When Rickert slaps Griffith, Locus is so pissed that he crushes the ledge he was holding onto with his bare hands. Silet notices this, which is why he wonders whether Locus was the one who sent an apostle to assassinate Rickert later in the day. The Moonlight Knight's blind dedication to the God-Hand is commendable in a way, but we wonder whether he even knows that he's basically an ant to the man he serves. During the Black Swordsman arc, the God-Hand made it very clear that despite being closely associated with the creation of apostles, they viewed them as nothing more than inconsequential servants. The only reason Griffith has war demons in his party is because they're spiritually wired to worship him and follow his commands, especially in his direct presence. We wonder what Locus would think of his role in the grand scheme of causality if he realized the kind of bloodshed Griffith had caused to get his powers. While the cost for an apostle's ascension is limited to a few people they're close to become a God-Hand, the sacrifice is much bigger, and the slaughter needed to incarnate them into the physical world is even bigger than that. Would the Moonlight Knight be able to live with himself once he discovers that cost? Only time will tell. Irvine. While Locus's thinking is laid bare in the statements he makes and the way he views the new world, you'd be hard-pressed trying to use the same logic to figure out Irvine's motivations. The Hunter Apostle is an even bigger enigma than Nosferatu Zud, if you can believe it, but we can still make a few educated guesses as to his origins and motivations. See, Irvine doesn't talk much. He usually just stands around, surveying the scene, or is busy tearing the heads off of his enemies using his arrows. And yeah, we're not kidding when we say that. The one time we do see him have an extended dialogue with someone, he introduces himself as a hunter. When he was human, Irvine would traverse through mountains and woods alike for days, chasing his prey like a patient predator. It wasn't long before he became a beast himself, which can only be a reference to the day he became an apostle. Based on his apostle form and the role he plays in the New World, we'd guess that Irvine has joined the Falcon of Light to partake in the ultimate hunt to end all hunts. For starters, Irvine's apostle form makes him look like a satyr that merged with a cycloptic direwolf. The lower half of his body is all wolf, with a single eye in the middle of its head. The upper half of his body, located at the base of the wolf's tail, becomes more muscular, furrier, and gains horns as well. You don't need us to tell you that this form is a direct reflection of his claim that while hunting beasts in the wild, he became a beast himself. Irvine exchanged his soul for a body resembling an apex predator. He must have been a proficient archer in his human life as well, so much so that when he became an apostle, he put his vision inside of his bow. That's right, the reason Irvine doesn't have visible irises and such is because his true eye is in the center of his bow, which is his primary weapon as well. Miura took weapons being a part of their user's body a bit too literal for this one. However, it also gave us one of the coolest apostle transformation scenes in Berserk, as Irvine needs to activate his released form through his bow, so we're not complaining about this one bit. And when he's not serving directly under Griffith during a military campaign, Irvine is usually sent out with the refugee protection squads of Falconia in order to hunt down any creatures that Griffith's human soldiers can't take down. When he faces a cockatrice in chapter 332, he declares that this hunt was his, before transforming and taking down the Hell Beast with a single arrow. He takes a similar approach to the Band of the Falcons hunt of the Giants, so you get the idea we're conveying here. Irvine most likely joined Griffith seeking the ultimate hunt of his life, and while he looks forward to it, he doesn't mind helping out his leader with his war efforts. As the leader of the Falcons archery unit, Irvine has turned the tide of multiple battles in his group's favor with his pinpoint accuracy and decapitating arrows. His firepower increases as an apostle, and he can use organic arrows made from his fur, which expand into deadly spikes when they enter a target's body, shredding them to death from the inside. Though he usually keeps to himself, Irvine has formed a bond with Griffith's medium, Sonia, and acts as a guardian when her human protection detail isn't around. He also seems to take care of Griffith's dirty work for him, because chapter 372 made it seem like Irvine was the one who took care of an awakened Casca, rampaging through the Falcon's castle. While the Hunter Apostle appears all friendly and human, what with his lute playing and all, don't get it twisted. He's a demon, and the sooner he dies, the better it would be for anyone that opposes the Band of the Falcon, lest they enjoy parting ways with their heads. Grunbeld. This one you might be familiar with if you're keeping up with our recent content, but Grunbeld Alkvist becoming an apostle was never a question of if, it was always a question of when. Born with a rare condition that made him grow larger than any human being in his homeland, Grunbeld was constantly bullied for being different in his childhood. His background is much like Serpico's, as his mother always pushed him to act noble and dignified in all conflicts, even if it threatened his life. The big difference, however, is that Grunbeld actually came from a noble family, and it was the death of his father that made his mother bitter, not abandonment. Grunbeld's family was one of the poorer noble houses of Grant, but what they lacked in wealth, they made up for with their pride, and Grunbeld's mother drilled into him that the only way he'd reach the halls of heroes and see his ancestors was if he died a worthy death in battle. Things were so bad that Grunbeld didn't want to go home after losing fights to bullies because of how his mum would take the news. And then they got worse when Tudor forces invaded his homeland, because his mother was violated and killed in front of him, and all Grunbeld could do was hold in his rage. As the years progressed, he grew stronger and eventually found his way out of the Tudor conversion camp he'd been forced into. He went on to become the leader of Grant's principal fighting force and defended his homeland from outsiders for decades. That was until his Grand Duke sold Grant out to the Tudor and compelled Grunbeld's close friend Edvard to betray him. In the final moments of his life, Grunbeld held out against thousands of enemy soldiers and tanked cannon fire with his shield, but it was too much for his human shell to endure. Seeing his other friends suffer because of Edvard's betrayal, Grunbeld's suppressed rage boiled over, and he wondered if this meaningless death was all that was written for him. At that moment, his Behelit activated, and Grunbeld came face to face with the God Hand. They promised him an eternal war that he could fight as a fire-breathing dragon, and the raging Grunbeld, overcome with all kinds of emotions, accepted their offer. He transformed into a gigantic dragon-like apostle and immediately wiped out the Tudor forces surrounding him, devouring his traitor friend in the process. He went on to eliminate every other enemy force on Grant, and over time, his legend grew and he came to be remembered as the Flame Dragon Knight. Grunbeld joined Griffith's band during the Battle of Shet and has proven to be one of his most invaluable apostles till date. Grunbeld was already absurdly strong as a human, but as an apostle, his strength has become unmatched. He could lift columns as heavy as the stone hedge blocks with ease in his released state and has skin made out of the third hardest element in the world, corundum. He can breathe fire and trample over multiple enemies with surprising agility. So far, the only thing anyone's been able to do to him in this form is crack his face a little bit, but considering that someone was a fully berserk guts, it says a lot about Grunbeld's durability. Despite being an apostle, he upholds the chivalrous warrior's code, much like Locus, as seen when he challenges Guts to a fair duel. But we all know this is just a front to hide his real desire, which, as we've already noted, is eternal, glorious warfare. Grunbeld wants to let loose with all his might in a battle that'll make him worthy of finally seeing his ancestors. Too bad it won't happen, because as an apostle, he's fated to end up in the abyss. Still, seeing him in action is always great, and we're hoping we can see him in action once again very soon. Rakshas. From the leader of Griffith's Giants unit to the leader of his Search and Destroy squadron, it's time to talk about the apostle that defines apostlehood in Berserk, Rakshas. The word Rakshas in Hindi translates to demon, and it's a fitting name for a man that used to be a part of the Bakiraka clan. Although the clan itself is composed of the greatest assassins known to the West, killing in and of itself is not an act any of its members enjoy. The Bakiraka Prince Silat once stated that killing is nothing more than a duty for the Bakiraka, which is why Rakshas was excommunicated from the clan. He was a hedonistic assassin that reveled in playing with his targets, before finishing them off in gruesome fashion. This frivolous treatment of life made him a real threat to the clan's integrity, and so despite knowing Rakshas for a long time, Silat ended up exiling him. Little did he know that the exiled one would come into contact with the Behelit and turn it into his very namesake. What differentiates Rakshas from his fellow apostle commanders is the fact that he's openly stated his reasons for joining up with Griffith, but unlike Locus, Grunbeld, Irvine or even Zod, it isn't divine subjugation that made him do it. It's his obsession with killing. Given that Rakshas harbored evil in his heart long before he became an apostle, the God Hand had to only promise him the one thing he could never get from his human victims, the perfect assassination target. Ironically enough, this target happens to be Griffith, and therein lays the tale of contradiction. Rakshas joins up with Griffith because he wants to kill him, but until that day comes, he'll defend Griffith with his own life. Talk about twisted mentalities, eh? While he's well aware of his place in the pecking order of demonkind, Rakshas is not a weak apostle by any means. He has an amorphous body that looks like a black robe. Within this robe, Rakshas can move his face anywhere, and he often tricks people into thinking they got his head by wearing masks. He can also produce razor-sharp needles and blade-like appendages from his robes and use them as knives, projectiles, swords, pretty much anything he wants to use them for. These weapons are powerful enough to cut through solid stone, so they aren't just for show and dexterity. When he unleashes his full apostle transformation, Rakshas magnifies into the most terrifying piece of sentient cloth you've ever seen, and can even fly in this form. And he can also melt into the shadows, become one with them, and execute sneak attacks from within them. All of his physical features are geared toward making him the perfect assassin, which makes sense considering his life's ambition. But while he isn't focusing on hunting the Falcon, Rakshas spends his time tracking down and obliterating the remnants of Griffith's retreating enemies as the leader of his Search and Destroy unit. He also protects Griffith from assassination attempts by getting to the would-be assassins first. Rakshas is so fast that he can cover a distance of about 5 to 10 meters in less than a second. His only weakness is fire, because we've seen Ricket, Silat, and the Tapasa use firecrackers and a makeshift flamethrower to put a major hurting on Rakshas. The last time we saw the guy, he got rocked with a bazooka, and that was about 40 chapters ago. We've seen the rest of Griffith's war demon generals multiple times since then, so is Rakshas dead? Is he out on a secret mission, or is he just laying low and preparing himself to strike at his ultimate target within his own capital city? We'll have to wait and watch, but what we can guarantee is if Rakshas shows up again, complete chaos is to be expected. Mule Wolf Flame, a rare example of a feudal lord actually caring about his people. Perhaps it's his youth that makes Mule Wolf Flame such a dutiful noble. Coming from a family so far down the list of nobles that they're not even allowed to enter the Midland royal court, Mule nonetheless works tirelessly to ensure the safety of his people. During the Kushan invasion of Midland, his father and brothers get killed and his castle is occupied by the invaders. But Mule doesn't give up. He takes his resistance group outside of his castle's walls and resolves himself to an early death if it means he could protect his citizens. Mule was leading a suicidal charge against the Kushan occupiers of his city when one of his soldiers' wishes comes true. See? Before charging in, Mule had been encouraged to fall back and regroup with the band of the Falcon. Mule was shocked at hearing the band was active again, because to his best knowledge, Griffith had died in captivity 3 years ago. What's really shocking is how close Mule gets to the truth of Griffith's first life, as Griffith did die 3 years ago, just not in a Midland dungeon. But then he's told that the White Falcon is actually alive and has been liberating Midland territories ever since he re-emerged after a 3-year absence. Mule rejects the proposal in favor of defending his subjects with his own sword, but turns out his soldier was right, because Griffith shows up to save the day with his new band of the Falcon. They make short work of the occupying Kushan forces, and Mule marvels at the flawless organization of the warband, both in battle and in peace. The moment he sees Griffith in person, he's overcome with a sense of reverence and purpose, and he dedicates his sword to the White Falcon, despite thinking to himself that he doesn't even know this guy. From that day onward, Mule Wolfflame has been one of Griffith's foremost emissaries, and the protective detail of his medium and seer. Mule is more than a decent fighter on the field. Though he's trained in the orthodox style of fighting, he can keep up with crafty individuals like Bonebeard and Isidro and come out relatively unscathed. He's a decent cavalryman as well, and often serves as a warrior in the band of the Falcon's offensive efforts, although this could also be because the medium of the Falcon travels with her leader everywhere he goes. When Griffith wanted to get the Pope to Vritannis to strengthen his claim over Midland's throne, he sent Mule as his messenger, and given that his medium is prone to fits of sassiness and excessive blabbering, there's no one Griffith trusts more with handling Sonia than Mule. The duo develops a confrontational friendship, which sees Mule call Sonia out for her lack of social understanding and decency, and Sonia saved Mule from death repeatedly using her psionic powers. As a result of their encounter in Vritannis, Mule sees Isidro as a rival, but knows that the kid lacks the killing intent that most fighters their age possess. Lord Wolfflame might feel like a glorified bodyguard for most of his appearances in Berserk, but there are a few hints in the manga that suggest Mule might be like Owen in his skepticism of Griffith's leadership. Before he meets Griffith, Mule wonders why the Band of the Falcon is working with Kushan defectors and, worse, inhuman warriors in the War Demons. Though Mule wasn't particularly inclined towards the arcane arts, and he could sense the Apostles' bloodlust when he first saw them, and his instinctual disturbance was one that she should have put more stock into. After spending months fighting alongside them, Mule has come to see the War Demons as a part of Falconian society, which is dangerous for reasons we don't think we need to elaborate on any further. And considering the fact that he and Isidro have unfinished business, a showdown between the two sides' best boys is inevitable. What will be curious to see is whether Mule snaps out of his Griffith trance and realizes the true nature of his leader, which we think could occur if something happens to Sonia. Because despite their testy relationship, Mule sees protecting her as his duty, and if he learns that his leader himself was somehow involved in harming Sonia, he might just change his outlook on the whole savior of the people shtick Griffith is putting on for the world. As for his unfinished business with Isidro, we'd hate to see it wrap up in the middle of a war, but if war is inevitable, then so be it. May the man serving the right cause win that day. But having brought up Sonia the Seer, Sonia, one of the most divisive characters in all of Berserk. Sonia's backstory is as tragic as it gets. She's a Midlander whose parents were killed in front of her eyes by their Kushan captors. Sonia herself was part of a line of female prisoners, all of whom were presumably being sent to the capital city for the Emperor's inspection. Many who stood in line with her noted her blank expression and thought it was because of the trauma she'd witnessed. But in truth, Sonia was experiencing a prophecy. Ever since she was young, Sonia could see and hear things others couldn't, like their thoughts, whisperings of dead souls, etc. Over time, she realized she had the power to see the life force of living things clearly, and also she can predict the future. Unprompted, she proclaims that the Falcon shall arrive and save them all with an expression that is so blank, she appears possessed. Shortly after she says this, Griffith arrives in Shet and liberates the town and the townspeople. Sonia rushes to meet her rescuer, presumably because she wanted to thank him, but ends up just staring at him because of his otherworldly beauty. Griffith notices her, realizes her skills and astral powers, and takes her into his new Band of the Falcon as his medium and seer. Sonia's just happy to get on the ride to the new world because it lets her be close to the love of her life. And yes, we say love because Sonia is actually in love with Griffith, and we're pretty sure he knows it as well. In a story Sonia tells of her relationship with Griffith, she likens the two of them to a kite and a hawk, and the rest of humanity to ducks. She claims that though Griffith is supposed to marry the Duck Queen, aka Charlotte, because the other ducks want him to, the kite is the only one that soars the skies with the Falcon. Sonia clearly feels a kinship with Griffith because of the way they perceive the world, and to her, this has spilled over into the territory of feelings. This is why we see her often ridiculing Prince Charlotte. It's her way of acting out and getting Griffith's attention. As the medium of the Falcon, Sonia has been indispensable to the Falcon. She uses her odd perception abilities to guide Griffith to the heart of his enemy's forces, so he can kill their leader and put them to rout easily. Because she can see souls, Sonia helps Griffith conduct his ceremonies in Falconia, and has been known to call departing souls pretty, which is creepy, to say the very least. But then again, so is the fact that she has a smile stuck to her face at all times. Her thought transference is so advanced that she can connect to an entire battlefield's worth of people and not get exhausted. She used this to rally humanity behind the War Demons, so they could all get through the final war of the old world. And she also spouts out accurate prophecies now and then like a true oracle. Once, she told Zod that he would face the choice between using the blade of his enemy to his benefit or his doom, and that turned out to be true when Zod unexpectedly allied with Guts to take down Emperor Ganishka. Using her eyes that can perceive the astral world as clearly as the physical world, she can navigate the branches of the world's spiral tree and bring Falconian soldiers back home safely after accessing magical skyways. All of these abilities would have proven very useful to the Black Swordsman party had they found her first, but they might yet do that because of Sonia's relationship with Shirka. When Gus's party arrives in Vritannis, Sonia encounters Shirka at the docks. and the two quickly befriend each other. They have a short adventure saving some Kushan kids from pirates, and by the end of it, Sonya asks Shirka to join her if she didn't feel at home with her current group. Though Shirka declines, thinking of Guts, Sonya ominously states that the kite and the owl would meet again one day. She then walks away, ready to help Griffith usher in the new world, unaware that her new friend was actively working against that outcome. It appears as though Sonya is fated to meet her friend as an enemy one day, and we can only hope for her sake that day never comes. Griffith has been exploiting this girl's powers and feelings since day one for his personal gain, and once she realizes that, only Sonya knows how she'd react to it. Now that Casca is in Falconia, Griffith's veil of otherworldly decency can slip at any moment, and our most anticipated reaction to the same has to be Sonya's. The only times her veil of happiness has slipped is when the humans lost faith in the war demons, when Rickett slapped Griffith, and every time she's reminded of Princess Charlotte. The expression she'll have when she sees Shirky fighting against her leader will be priceless, and that's why we'll be there when it happens, breaking it all down for you guys. Shirka. Now let's move over to Sonya's parallel in the good camp and the bestest of best girls, Shirka the Forest Mage. The first time we saw Shirka in the series, she was trying to determine whether Griffith was the Falcon of Light or the Falcon of Darkness, and honestly, that alone made her a major player in the series. Not a lot of people outside of the Holy See higher-ups are familiar with the prophecy of the Falcon, and yet a girl barely in her teenage years not only knew of it, but was also actively working to understand it. Of course, we know that Griffith is more darkness than light, but getting back to the point, this introduced us not only to Shirka's character, but to the broader use of magic in the Berserkverse. In that introduction scene, Shirka was controlling the body of a bird to spy on Griffith, and that's literally the least impressive thing she can do with her skills. The most impressive has to be her summoning the Rotting Root Lord, considering how tricky controlling dark elements can be, but we're getting ahead of ourselves once again. Shirka is yet another Berserk character whose history we're unaware of. All we know is she was raised by the witch Flora since a young girl, and has learnt all that she knows of magic thanks to her mistress. Initially, Shirka was a rather rigid girl who felt superior to her traveling companions in Guts & Co. because of her superior knowledge of the astral world. In fact, we see her openly use her magic to charm guards at Britannis, which is something no street-savvy mage would do. But as time progresses and she gets more familiar with humans and their ways, Shirka manages to adapt to the world. See, Shirka was basically raised in the Spirit Mansion tree isolated from the rest of the world. Given that the practice of arcana was once the norm for humanity, she feels strongly about the Holy See's domination of the religious sphere of the world by stamping out or covering up symbols of older faiths. She thinks that the brutality and brusqueness of her traveling companions and other humans is unjustified, because she knows the effects it has had on humanity's potential. But with time, she comes to appreciate the complexities of human nature, and goes on to befriend people like Sonya, Mule, Morda, and more. Shirka was an extremely sheltered girl at her introduction, relying on her mistress for guidance quite often. But in her journey with Guts' party, she's gained immense confidence in herself, and is now teaching Farnace how to perform magic. It's thanks to Shirka's lessons that Farnace ends up being recognized as a prodigy by Elfhelm's mages, which is an extremely high honor in the first place. And speaking of magic, well, without Shirka, Guts would be dead by now. She's used her magic to save her friends from trolls, ogres, kelpies, Makara sea beasts, pirates, internalized trauma-born versions of apostles, you name it. Shirka is exceptional at odd manipulation and can basically do the same thing Griffith does with deceased souls. She summoned and borrowed the powers of powerful nature spirits like the Lady of the Depths, that Root Lord we mentioned earlier, and a Burning Wheel of Flames, all of which are powerful enough to muddle the minds and wills of less experienced mages. She's fought against powerful sorceress enemies like Daiba and Ganishka, being the decisive factor in her team getting the win in both cases. And let's just say that if Shirka wasn't present beside Guts whenever he used the full powers of the Berserker armor, we wouldn't have a series protagonist right now. After guiding Casca through the Corridor of Dreams, Shirka becomes eligible for commuting with the demons of the astral realm, which is a privilege reserved for those en route to becoming great gurus. This indicates that Shirka has already reached a higher form of magical understanding, and to do so at her age is practically unheard of these days. Currently, she's engaged in a ritual that casts her luminous body into the world spiral tree, so she can traverse its branches and go scout Falconia for her crew. From being a shut-in introvert to taking such immense risks, Shirka has come a long way, and we suspect that she'll be crucial to Guts' final battle against Griffith. We've already mentioned her own fated encounter with Sonya, but Shirka is a strong witch in her own right now, and she could probably take care of an apostle or a few by herself. We can't wait for Best Girl's return from her life-threatening vision because, well, 1, we want to know what she knows, and 2, the way Guts gave up to the Kushan, we have a feeling he's going to need Shirka beside him permanently here on out. Ivalera. Another pixie-type elf like Puck, Ivalera is Shirka's constant companion and magical partner. Whenever Shirka has to conduct a ritual, Ivalera is already done setting up the stage for her, which just goes to show you how close those two are. Whenever Ivalera blurts out Shirka's embarrassing true thoughts and feelings on a situation, like her crush on Guts, the young mage stuffs the elf in her hat and pulls it down over her head hard. We don't know whether Ivalera met Shirka before she came to Flora's or after, but we do know that without her, Shirka would probably not have made it as far as she has. Because of the time they've spent together, Ivalera has come to memorize most of Shirka's rituals and what to do in case they go awry. When Shirka summoned the Lady of the Depths, she lost herself in the summoning trance because her emotional turmoil ended up aligning with the spirit's torrential nature. Ivalera panicked at first, but then recalled that to bring Shirka back, they had to tap her staff on flat ground thrice. This is especially impressive given elves' notoriously short memories. Puck doesn't even remember the God Hand's faces in detail despite having spent an extended period in their presence. He just recalls their major features. Ivalera not only memorizing the rituals, but also the failsafe procedures, shows you just how deeply she cares for Shirka. She also boasts about her friend's skills frequently, often claiming that Guts and his party would be dead without her, which is the truth. From a personality perspective, Ivalera is different from Puck. Where Puck is overtly goofy, Ivalera puts on an air of dignity and classiness. She often chides Puck for his complete lack of knowledge about anything even remotely astral, and takes great pride in showing off her own. To be fair, Ivalera probably knows more about magic than any other elf in the series, considering she's been a part of many of Shirka's rituals. But this isn't to say the two elves don't share similarities. Like Puck, Ivalera has a tendency to get a big head up on achieving the smallest of objectives, and she too is prone to mischief. Where Puck has taken up residence on his disciple Isidro's head, Ivalera sees Farnace as Shirka's apprentice and maidservant. The two have more in common than they'd like to admit, and we think that's on purpose. But the real reason we put Ivalera on our list is because of the fact that she, like Puck, survives the destruction of Elfhelm. When the island disappears, so does every astral creature in its vicinity. Heck, even the Merrows that carried Guts' party to Elfhelm end up disappearing, despite not being from Skellig Island originally. But Ivalera and Puck remain. This means that causality likely has a bigger role in mind for both of them, and we'll get an idea of what that is when the War Council before the final war takes place. It's funny thinking that this absolute cutie will end up being part of a war ordained by fate itself, but we already know she'll throw hands if someone even so much as side-eyes Shirka, so we wouldn't count her out just yet. Flora. When Griffith sends an entire contingent of war demons to take out just you, you know you're badass. And trust us guys, Flora knew she was badass, all caps. The resident witch of the Spirit Mansion Tree near Enoch Village, Flora is one of the oldest and wisest characters in the series. She's Shirka's mistress, and she taught her everything she knows about magic. She's Skull Knight's friend and was the keeper of the Berserker armor for centuries. She guides Guts on his path of vengeance while doing her best to steer him away from it and giving him talismans that help dull the effects of his and Casca's brand, something he didn't know was possible. As a 1,000-year-old mage, Flora has immense knowledge about the way causality functions, and we see it on full display when she contradicts Skull Knight's circular interpretation of it, calling it a spiral instead. Skull Knight believes that which was is fated repeats itself, but Flora is of the belief that fate can appear to repeat itself, but ultimately it's the choice of the one upon whom it's bestowed to accept it or not. Flora always finds the good in people and situations somehow or the other, and that isn't a magical skill. That's just a testament to her worldly wisdom. She used to be a prolific healing mage in her earlier years and helped many a villager from Enoch and other parts of the world get healthy again. But with the rise of the Holy See, she was forced to sequester herself and hasn't stepped out of the Spirit Mansion Tree's grounds for ages. What makes Flora one of Berserk's most integral characters is her role in nudging forward the future of the story, whilst having a hand in its dubious past. Let's talk about the future first. By inspiring Shirka to walk her path in the human world without inhibition and to look for signs that defy logic yet still are real as day, she helped her student become a mistress herself. When Griffith attacked Flora's Spirit Tree Mansion, she'd already resigned herself to defeat, but she didn't give up meekly. Instead, as her home burned down around her, Flora turned into a living wall of flame that not even Grunbeld the Dragon Apostle could cross. This helped her disciple and her companions escape without being pursued, and turns out Flora didn't exactly die. Her existential form changed from human to demon, the latter being the equivalent of a highly powerful astral entity. In her final parting message to Shirka, she told her disciple that the days together were her fondest, and that they'd meet again in her dreams. Shirka thought that this was a metaphor for the longest time, until it actually happened when she and Farnace traversed the Corridor of Dreams. Flora showed up in her demon form and helped Shirka and Farnace in fending off the hordes of creatures attacking the final fragment of Casca's fractured mind. All of these things suggest that Flora was easily top 3 in the magic world of Berserk, which begs the question, how could she die so easily at Griffith's hands? The answer to that lies in her past. The reason Flora is friends with Skull Knight isn't because they met one day randomly. They've known each other since back when he was King Geyserik. In those days, Flora resided on Elfhelm and was a disciple of the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms, the powerful magical ruler of the island. This lady priestess was Skull Knight's lover in his human life, and Elfhelm inhabitants like Gedfring and Volvarba recall the days when Flora was still their friend, but their opinion of her differs at present. Gedfring remembers her fondly, likely because they were both admirers and friends of Geyserik himself. But Volvarba thinks of Flora as a troublemaker because she broke a taboo in the aftermath of that first eclipse, which ended up getting her exiled from the island. So she arrived at the Spirit Tree Mansion and became its self-appointed guardian, recognizing the place as an important anchor between the physical and astral worlds. But this is why Griffith sent his war demons to kill one old lady, because she guarded a place that needed to be destroyed for him to control the world. Flora herself states on multiple occasions that she'd lived beyond her natural lifespan, which is why by the time Griffith came for her, she was happier to pass into a different existential form that continues fighting in her current one. From a technical standpoint, Flora is still in the story, considering the fact that demons, as astral creatures, should have manifested in the physical world after the Great Roar. If this is true, and if our characters find her again, maybe she can answer some of Berserk's biggest questions, and maybe, just maybe, she can see her favorite disciple's bashful smile once again, if there's no time for a full-blown tea party. Magnifico. One character we do not want to see smiling anytime soon, though, is this guy, because when he flashes his pearly whites, he's usually up to some sort of scheme. The youngest son of Federico de Vendimian and the older brother of Farnace and Serpico, Magnifico de Vendimian is the spitting image of his father in his youth. He has the same hooked eyebrows, nose, jawline, and curly blonde hair as his dad. In fact, at one point in the series, his mother comments that he's becoming more and more like a young Federico with each passing day. Now, you might think that's a compliment considering Federico is the richest man in the world, but trust us when we say Magnifico's mum was insulting him with that one. This is because, despite being a Vendimian, his father gave him no major responsibility. His oldest brother, Giorgio, was supposed to become the next head of the Vendimian head, succeeding their father directly. His second brother, Poliziano, was in running to become the next pontiff of the Holy See, which, if it were to happen, would put both the church and the bank in the hands of one family. But Magnifico, he wasn't exactly as gifted as his brothers in the, shall we say, intellectual department. Because he grew up as a Vendimian, Magnifico has a rather entitled outlook on things, and, no, we don't mean he expects people to grovel before him all the time. He isn't that entitled. Yet. No. Instead, what we mean is, Magnifico expects people to go along with whatever scheme he cooks up to gain his father's approval, or even better, get ahead of him in the political game. This is why his mother called him a spitting image of a young Federico, by the way. Yeah. Not exactly a compliment, we know. A few examples of Magnifico's insane schemes, including betrothing his sister to his childhood friend just to get her friends a ship and take away the decision of choosing Farnace's husband from his dad. After joining up with Guts on their journey, Magnifico decides he'll capture all the elves from Elfhelm and sell them to create a financial empire of his own. He foolishly thinks that his salt-of-the-earth friend Roderick will help him in this, and when that doesn't work out, he gets the mischievous Puck in on his scheme. When they try to put it into action, the whole thing unravels comically quickly and Magnifico is forced to do menial labor as punishment. He's that friend in the group that's always looking for the next get-rich-quick scheme, which is pretty ironic considering he comes from, and we're paraphrasing here, dummy money. And to round it all out, Magnifico is a grade A coward. Every time Guts' crew finds themselves in a fight, Magnifico is the first one to look for a hiding place, and over the course of their journey, he's gone from looking like a proud nobleman to a haggard miser. But putting aside his role as comic relief in the story, there's one thing he's done better than anyone else in his family, and that's sticking by his sister, Farnace. And no, we're not counting Serpico here because he isn't a Vendimian. Magnifico might scheme and manipulate events, but he isn't a malicious person by nature. Yeah, he's greedy, but he isn't exactly evil in the traditional sense of the term. He doesn't understand Farnace's magical powers, but he is still the first person to acknowledge her existence in the Vendimian household after Serpico, and that kind of thing tends to leave a lasting impression, you know. While Magnifico is generally a coward, we suspect that if his sister's life was in serious jeopardy, he'd take a bullet for her without thinking. So we're just waiting for Studio Gaga to get to that moment so he becomes relevant. Otherwise, he's just Chestnut Puck with extra steps, and minus the fourth wall breaking references. Nobody wants that from a character in a series like Berserk now, do they? Roderick. Coming to Magnifico's salt-of-the-earth friend, if there was ever a man that could make us swoon with his sheer romanticism, it'd be Roderick of Lith. Born the third son of the ruler of an isolationist island nation, Roderick is a maverick in his own right. As a seaman, he has the heart of a sailor and yearns to sail the world. But as a nobleman, he has considerable respect in the community, and as a warrior, he's known as the Sailing Prince of Lith. This is because Roderick can easily sink 3 attacking ships with a single vessel under his command, and when he was at the helm of a deck, ships would run as smoothly as horses galloping on grasslands. This is probably why his flagship is called the Seahorse, a triple-deck war galley that's as swift as it is vicious in combat. Roderick is one of the better nobles in the series because he's as dutiful and chivalrous as Azan, but also far more free-spirited than the old mustached knight. Like we told you earlier, Roderick is a romantic, and his inner romantic kicks into full gear the moment he lays eyes on Farnace. Roddy is a perceptive man. He knows that the arranged betrothal doesn't guarantee Farnace will love him, and he's willing to play the field if it means she becomes his prize. He does everything he does for Guts and his crew out of a desire to spend time with Farnace initially, but over time, he grows to not only respect Guts, but also thinks of him as a friend. And if you think Loverboy here can't put up a fight, well, you're sorely mistaken. Roderick helped Guts and co. hold off Ganishka's Daka and Pishacha Ghana when the Dread Emperor tried to sneak attack Holy See nobility in Britannis. He adapted on the fly when he learnt that his usual weapons were useless against astral creatures, so he used a silver candelabrum to get the job done instead. Roderick has fought many astral creatures since then, including the Sea God, from whom he managed to keep his vessel damage-free, a near impossible accomplishment considering the god's size. Roderick is extremely brave, as he volunteers to go look for Guts within the dying sea god's belly, and a loyal leader as well, for he prioritizes his crew's health over his own. Nowhere is this more visible than when he begs the Kushan boarders of the Seahorse to treat his crewmates with dignity, for many of them were elders, women and children. Roderick is a smart man because he immediately asks the Kushan to speak with someone who knows Midland's language, but he knows he can talk his way out of this situation. That's exactly what he does when Rickett finally arrives on the scene, and Roderick manages to get his friends and crew unbound at the very least. As of this moment, he's headed to the Kushan capital with the core Black Swordsman party, and we expect him to start taking up a more active role going forward. Roderick's the only man, besides the Kushan now, who can mobilize a navy to blockade Falconius Harbor. Besides, his skill at sea was what Guts sent his party to Elfhelm in the first place. If the boys had to travel by sea again, we're sure they'll want Roddy at the helm. He'll also soon become aware of the many hidden truths of Griffith's existence, and given his reputation, perhaps he can start spreading the word amongst the nobility that the Falcon of Light is not to be trusted. As for his potential relationship with Farnace, we're not sure how likely it is. Farney loves Guts, and we have to believe Roderick can see this, but if he doesn't, well, good for him. And if they do end up together, even better. There's one dude who deserves the world and more, it's Roderick. And yeah, you can get all your man-crush jokes out in the comments now. Daiba, the wizard general of the Kushan Empire, and second in command to the Dread Emperor himself. Daiba is one of the most intriguing characters in all of Berserk. Like Flora, his knowledge of the astral world runs deep. In fact, it might be even greater than hers, considering Daiba was able to reverse engineer a Behelit, where Flora could only dampen the brand of sacrifice for 3 days. But Daiba was introduced as the right-hand man of the main antagonist of the Millennium Falcon arc, and that's where we'll begin with his story. As an old man, whose age can't be determined by the traditional factors, Daiba has seen and done a lot in this world. All magic in Berserk shares the same basis, but its interpretation varies from culture to culture. While the Sylph Sword is controlled by wind elementals based on British folktales, Daiba calls its wielder Serpico the warrior of Vayu. In Hinduism, Vayu is the god of the wind, so you can see why we said that the interpretation of the same magic system is different across cultures. He calls Guts a warrior of Durga, and considering Durga is the war goddess in Hinduism, maybe the Berserker armor's main property is to make its wearer's mentality more warlike. He looks old and decrepit, but Daiba is one of the most powerful sorcerers in the series. He's the creator of the Pishacha Ghana, which is a unit of Ganishka's army that uses animal-based familiars to engage in ambush attacks. Daiba himself commands the strongest aqueous familiar we've seen in the series, as his Kundalini can literally cut ships in half with its concentrated water cannon. He also has 4 pterodactyl-looking familiars called Garudas, who serve as his primary mode of transportation. If he needed to, he could also levitate in mid-air using a spell, though he tended to do this only when relaxing. And as we mentioned earlier, he reverse-engineered a Behelit by understanding its inner workings to create his life's greatest accomplishment, the man-made Behelit. A monster of a contraption made out of a large tank, amniotic fluids, and the stitched-together bodies of still-living apostles, Daiba's man-made Behelit wasn't used to create apostles. Instead, it created a unique type of soldier unit for Ganishka, called the Daka. These demonic hellspawn were created when a pregnant woman was lowered into the tank. The evil astral energy that powered the interiors of apostles would end up surging through the pregnant woman's body after submersion and mutated the child in her belly into a monstrous Daka soldier, which then chews its way out of her alive, turning its mother into its first meal. These Daka are then armed and outfitted, and used as the true front line of Ganishka's armies. Using his crew of Harashada, who could remotely control both units, Daiba revolutionized ambush and guerrilla warfare in Berserk. He could take over entire coastlines of a nation in a single night with negligible casualties, and in the case his secret armies were discovered, then he could have his Harashada make them commit suicide to keep their secret safe. All of these astral innovations suggest that Daiba's knowledge of the astral world runs deeper than perhaps even the greatest gurus of Elfhelm. When he sees Griffith's new band of Falcon in action, he's shocked because he sees apostles and humans fight alongside each other willingly. Having served under an apostle ruler and being intimately acquainted with the dark side of the astral world, Daiba knows just how much of an abomination apostles are to mankind. This is why the sight of apostles and humans fighting side by side baffles him. Despite coming up with some of the most innovative war strategies the world had ever seen, Daiba ends up losing the Kushan Midland War when Ganishka decides to use the man-made Behelit on himself. Daiba has had a deep connection to the Kushan Emperor since even before he became his advisor. In fact, it was Daiba who gave Ganishka his Behelit, likely having seen the outcome of the same in one of his fortune-telling sessions. Given that Daiba's goal was to establish a magical empire of his own, he decided to ally himself with the Dread Emperor and deliver his blood-stained empire to him wrapped up in tiger pelts. But when Ganishka ignored his warnings and forcefully reincarnated himself again, Daiba's dreams, along with his previous life, were demolished. When Ganishka emerges from the man-made Behelit in his hideous Shiva form, Daiba is terrified of him. Nothing he says to his former leader gets through to him anymore. In this form, Ganishka is mindless, and because of his massive size, he thinks Daiba is a fly that's buzzing around his many heads. The Wizard General of the Kushan Empire was at ground zero for the Great Roar of the Astral World, and following it, he decided to lay low in the restored capital city of Falconia. Daiba started tending to the stables of the inn Luca managed. His animal control powers made the job easy for him, and he could hide his Garudas in a spare shed thanks to Luca's helpful disposition. When he sees Silat infiltrate Falconia and conspire to escape with the brother of the girl who helped him walk again, Daiba decides to leave with them. He shows up in the middle of Ricket and Silat's fight with Rakshas, helping them keep the apostle off their backs in exchange for the promise of safe shelter. Daiba's Garudas carry the Falconia escapees away, and the next time we see him, he seemingly switched sides entirely. Daiba is now an advisor to Silat, who's become the leader of the remnants of the Kushan Empire. He's the one who led the Kushan expedition to the Seahorse, and it's thanks to his oracle that Guts and his friends are no longer stranded at sea. But given the fact that he covered up his knowledge of Guts being their objective by dressing it up as an oracle in front of Silat, we can't safely say that Daiba should be trusted. The Wizard General might share a common goal with the rest of the gang, but his own desire for a magical empire can finally be fulfilled, now that the entire world is in an interstice. What he does besides helping the protagonists with their plans is what you should focus on with Daiba, because if he turns on the crew at some point in the story, they'll have major problems on their hands. Ganishka, one of the greatest antagonists of Berserk. The Dread Emperor Ganishka was introduced like the demonic spectre that he is, and hats off to Miura-sensei for doing that. The oldest son of the previous Kushan Emperor, Ganishka grew up not in a home but in a pit of snakes. When he was young, his mother tried to poison him so the throne would go to his younger sibling, but he survived. He then killed his brother to remove his claim permanently, with the mother committing suicide out of grief shortly. Before he became a proper man, Ganishka had already eliminated most political opposition to him at court. After coming of age, he sees the terror his father harbors in his eyes because of Ganishka's ruthlessness, and the Dread Prince ends up becoming the Dread Emperor just like that. After ascending the throne, Ganishka dedicated his entire life to a campaign of global conquest in order to avoid processing his pain and fear. After spending many years conquering other lands, when Ganishka finally came home, his own son tried to have him killed because of his cruelty. Ganishka uses his Behelit to summon the God Hand, and in exchange for obtaining godlike powers, he sacrifices his son to the abyss. Once that deal's concluded, Ganishka seeks out Daiba, making him his Wizard General, and triples down on his ambition for world conquest, which is what eventually leads to his demise. You see, despite being a human being, Ganishka was born to rule. He had a strong self-identity even before he found the Behelit, and after activating it, he managed to retain his true personality. This is why he stands up to the God Hand member Femto himself, and thinks that him and his armies can get the job done. A monarch's pride can make him think he's above God himself, and that's exactly what was happening over here. To be fair to him, Ganishka isn't overestimating his own stats. When Ganishka turns into his release state, he takes the shape of a giant thundercloud with a striking resemblance to his face. This thundercloud can grow in size, shrink in size, make Ganishka intangible and thus immune to conventional weapons, and also burn apostles mid-flight into an electrified mess. Ganishka can also use his fog as a surveillance net, tracking the movements of anyone that touches it. All of these things make Ganishka believe that the entire world was in the palm of his hands, and well, to be fair to him, he had good reason to think so. Then he came face to face with Griffith and realized his instinctual helplessness in front of a God Hand, and that changed everything. Ganishka was made to realize just how much more powerful Griffith was than him. The guy literally brought the wind to Ganishka's mobile palace. What can serve as better proof of Griffith's absolute powers than this, right? Ganishka was rightly pissed at the gulf that existed between their powers, and he decided that he would bridge the gap by reincarnating himself once again, this time artificially. Ganishka takes a dip in the man-made Behelit, and we'd like to think he was just hoping for more power and a hair color change in terms of transformations. Instead, he emerged as the Cthulhu-esque end god Shiva and began destroying everything in sight. Every person Ganishka killed with his massive body would end up becoming a pseudo-apostle that looked just like him facially, and they became his final line of offense and defense. This all would be great if Ganishka had also not been rendered mindless because of absorbing abnormal amounts of spiritual energy. As the world crumbled around him, Ganishka cried out for the light of salvation, and his prayers were answered by none other than Griffith. Turns out the reason Ganishka was reincarnated twice had nothing to do with his personal choices and everything to do with causality. Ganishka's Shiva avatar is defeated by Griffith in his release state as Femto, but not with his own spatial powers. Femto manipulates the abyssal sword stroke of Skull Knight's sword of actuation to do the job this time, and this is because that is what aligns with causality's plans. One who has been twice reincarnated and a sword stroke that reaches deeper still within that vortex have opened the door. This is roughly what Griffith mutters to himself before triggering the great roar of the astral world, and what this says to us is that everything about that moment was premeditated. The reason the God Hand offered the Slug Count another chance at ascension was because they needed that kind of physiology for the next phase of their plan to work. When Slug Count rejected it, the God Hand waited until Ganishka came around, and when he did, they got to work on putting the entire globe within an interstice. Why do you think Griffith insisted Wyndham become their final battleground? Because he knew his true castle was waiting for him sleeping underneath the earth. When the powers dwelling within a twice-reincarnated apostle are cleaved open by an abyss-connected spatial slash, it causes a chain reaction that puts the whole world in an interstice, and this is why Ganishka's life and death were pretty much set in stone by causality. The biggest irony in all of this is that Ganishka hated Griffith in life, but in his final moments, he found peace only because of Griffith. His body became the source of the Great Roar, and his corpse mutated into the world's spiral tree, which is now the hub of all spiritual energy flowing in and around Falconia. Despite having just a handful of appearances, Emperor Ganishka established himself as not just the cruelest of villains we've seen, but also the one that's had the most impact on the story. Without him, we wouldn't get even half of what Miura did with the story post-conviction arc, and for that at least, we're glad. Isma. If Happy-Go-Lucky had a face, it'd be hers, because despite facing severe hardships in life, Isma has never taken it too seriously. Born on a tiny island that was only accessible after a long voyage, Isma grew up alone in a cabin near the shoreline. Her father passed away when she was little, and she never knew her mother. Isma learned how to take care of herself very early on in her life, and that was perhaps for the best because her village folk would shun her as she grew up. Isma didn't know this at the time, but the reason she's never seen her mom is because, she lives underwater. Isma is a human Mero hybrid, and as such possesses the ability to turn into a Mero, although she didn't know this for a long time. She also didn't know that her modest hut was protected with a powerful stave, in order to keep the terrible sea god's influence from corrupting her. As a consequence of her isolated lifestyle, she often got bullied by the kids of her island, but Isma never let it get to her, even once. In fact, her cheerful disposition is such a breath of fresh air that Isidro ends up bleeding out of his nostrils in their first proper interactions. Oh wait, we just remembered who he is and why that happened. Anyway, as we were saying, Isma never let her fellow islanders' perception of her dampen her spirits. Because she stayed in one location her entire life, Isma desired to see the world outside, and thus loves every story Isidro tells her of his exploits, even if they aren't real. Isma has a naivety that makes her dependable as a human, and in her Mero form, she's damn near indispensable. The first time she awakened her power was after Guts killed the sea god and got trapped in it. Isma heard a voice call to her from the ocean, and she jumped in. Turns out, it was her mum, and after having a brief reunion, Isma's mother gave her the plan of action. She tells Isma her real name and asks her to think it so she can unlock her transformation. After she gets over the fact that she has a tail, Isma goes out to help her mum fight the sea god and locate Guts. Using their songs, the Meros figure out Guts is still alive and help fish him out of the sea. Pun intended. After helping rescue her newfound friends, Isma realizes she no longer has a home to return to and starts crying when Isidro offers her to join them. She gladly accepts and becomes a part of the Black Swordsman party. For the first time in her life, she has friends that don't hate him. She's just reunited with her long-lost mother, and she's finally going on an adventure like she always wanted to. Heck, it even looks like she's sweet on Isidro and him on her, given the way they treat each other and behave around each other. This is why, when Isma disappeared along with the rest of Elfhelm after the island's destruction, Isidro was left speechless. He had no idea how to put into words the emotions he was feeling, so he just became an emotionless wall. He obsesses over ways in which they could possibly bring her back, and that's just it. Isma has to come back because she still has a plot threat left wide open. When Isma becomes a Mero for the first time, she learns that all astral creatures have a calling name and a real name. The real name of any astral creature has immense power, as it can unlock your hidden potential, like it did for Isma. But conversely, if a person that is not the creature in question says their real name, then they lose their free will and essentially become slaves for the invokers. This is especially dangerous when you consider the fact that every battle here on out will involve the arcane arts in some way, shape or form. Ivalira warned her against divulging her real name to anyone, but Isma simply told her that she trusts every one of her friends. This'll surely come back to bite her in the ass one day, and we sincerely hope Isidro finds her and saves her before that happens. Danan, the Flower Storm Monarch and the ultimate ruler of Elfhelm, Danan is one of the most powerful and mysterious characters in the series. She's the most powerful magical being on the entirety of Skellig Island, yet she dresses and acts like an attendant for the great gurus to keep relations smooth between them and the elves. She looks like a child but has wisdom way beyond her years, and ends up showing you just how much of a child you are if you keep talking to her presumptuously. She doesn't always show off her powers, but when she does, it's a spectacle, and she almost never shows off her real form, so when she does, you can't help but gaze at her in amazement. Danan looks like a humanoid elf with skin and hair and eyes tinged the color of cherry blossoms. She has two massive antennae jutting out of her head, and her massive wings make her look like a pink butterfly almost. Not only is she extremely beautiful, Danan is also extremely powerful, as she's the one who initiates the Corridor of Dreams ritual that eventually saves Casca's mind. But the reason she's on this list isn't for her current accomplishments, it's for what she means to the story. You might have noticed that Danan is a particularly huge elf. In fact, if you didn't know any better, you'd think she was a human being whose skin had been transmuted into elfin textures. Well, as it turns out, that just might be the case. Remember we told you that Flora was exiled from Elfhelm for doing something taboo? Okay, now, do you guys know what Puck thought of Skull Knight when he first met him? If you don't, he thought SK felt kinda like an elf. And we know Skull Knight has had some sort of resurrection spell applied to his soul, otherwise he wouldn't be bound to his skeletal armor today. Well, turns out Danan looks nearly identical to the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms, the same woman that Skull Knight loved in his human life. And considering Flora was the Lady Priestess's protege, what if she couldn't bear the loss of her mentor and her friend? It's very likely that Flora used some kind of resurrection magic on her deceased mentor to bind her body to the Cherry Blossom spirit tree in its current elfin form. This is why Danan doesn't remember who Skull Knight is, but often wonders why he looks at the Lady Priestess's gravestone with a wistful aura about him. Their interaction in chapter 363 clearly implies that these two past lovers live distinct lives now, and no amount of memory magic was going to make them recall their relationship. When Griffith arrived on Elfhelm, Danan was powerless against him, and all she could do was watch her island disappear into the astral world. Considering that that's where Isma went as well, we know Isidro will be looking for a way to reconnect with Elfhelm somehow, and we hope he brings Danan along for the ride. Not only could Guts' side use the help, it could finally clear up one of Berserk's biggest mysteries, and hopefully give Skull Knight's soul the closure it so desperately needs. Morda, one of the most recent additions to the Berserk roster, Morda is the goth anime waifu of your dreams, at least when she's not setting a wicker man on you. The playful and arrogant witch in training is the rebel of Elfhelm, because unlike her peers, she wishes to use magic the way she thinks it was intended to be used, and not just to practice floral spells in the sunspot of the garden. She's a student of the only true witch of Elfhelm, Volvaba, and has shown time and again that she isn't afraid to stir up a bit of trouble every now and then. The Wicker Man is a spiritual object imbued with the souls of humans who once tried to attack Elfhelm a long time ago. Using it was taboo because of its taboo nature. But when Guts & Co. arrives at Elfhelm, Morda set a Wicker Man on them to stop the intruders. That's only half true, because she also wanted to see the Burning Man in action. Upon meeting the outsiders, she immediately takes a liking to Shirka and even Isidro, for the latter's ballsy attitude. Morda and Shirka bond over learning how to fly a broomstick and witnessing the Berserker armor's blood memory, and we learn that Morda just wants to go out into the world and stretch her legs for real. Her wish is granted in the most depressing way possible, because Griffith shows up and destroys her home, forcing her into the world outside. But the devastation of her homeland doesn't perturb Morda as much as the peril of her fellow rescued mages, and this is where we see her practical and helpful side come out. While the rest of the crew was panicking about their next move, Morda was the one who stepped in and reminded everyone they had injured people to heal and work to do. When Guts was pulled up in chains by the Kushan, Morda was the only one who expressed relief at him being okay, not even realizing that Guts being that calm was completely out of character for him. Despite her outwardly brazen persona, Morda is a rather organized witch who knows her priorities, and that kind of an ally is going to be really helpful in a war where uncertainty will reign supreme. Morda's ability to make quick, reasoned, and decisive judgment calls might save countless lives one day, and all she asks in exchange is for a good time. Not that way, you perverts. Gedfring, one of the oldest great gurus of Elfhelm's mage villages, and an old friend of Flora and Skull Knight, Gedfring is a character that anchors Berserk's past to its present and future. 1,000 years ago, he used to attend King Geyseric's town hall sessions with his father Vid. He decided to stay back at the village to hone his skills at the arcane arts, while Geyseric took his leave and went on to conquer the world. Because time works differently in Elfhelm, we can't guess Gedfring's true biological age, but we don't need to because it's his role that concerns us more in this entry. As we said a moment ago, Gedfring is one of the great great gurus of Elfhelm. He's a mage whose skills are so advanced he can cause rainfall without forming a seal or using an enchantment or a casting circle. He's also one of the most patient teachers in Berserk, as he somehow manages to calmly deal with the antics of Puck and Morda. Getfring rides a Markhor in most of his appearances as his legs don't work that well anymore, but his mind is just as sharp as it was in his youth. His knowledge of the astral world helps us understand more about the nature of what's occurring in Berserk through one chapter, as opposed to reading through entire volumes trying to piece things together. Getfring explains the great roar of the astral world, the world's spiral tree, how a Behelit works from a pathway perspective, and a lot more. He's the one who reveals the concept of spirit trees in Berserk, and explains that each spirit tree is like a parasite that feeds off the power of the world's spiral tree. The world's spiral tree itself is a giant fissure between the physical and astral realms, through which travel to either realm is possible. Now, as long as there are spirit trees that leech off this power, Griffith would never be able to fully control the way the world works. So he sets his mind to destroying every spirit tree that isn't the one in his backyard, which is how Flora ended up getting targeted. And now that the Garden of the Spirit Trees was nearly all ash, Griffith's consolidation of power would soon know no bounds. Getfring explains that people can take two paths into the astral world: the Elfin path, which leads to shallow layers of the interstice, and the Dragon's path, which takes people deep into the astral world. He says Behelits open up the Dragon path, and that honestly makes a lot of sense, considering that Godhand is said to reside within the deepest layers of the astral world. Getfring casually confirms that Falconia is in fact Geyseric's sunken capital, and can only respond with awe when Guts tells him why Griffith is doing what he's doing. Getfring understands the motivation for a kingdom, but equates Griffith changing the world for it with an act of madness. And guess what, folks? He's absolutely right. Getfring was present when Skull Knight took Guts to meet Hanar, the creator of the Berserker armor, and he witnessed the Black Swordsman experience its blood memory. He's been keeping a close eye on things with his crystal ball since before Guts arrived, and now that he's stranded with the Black Swordsman's crew, Getfring has no other choice but to contribute to the upcoming war effort. His centuries worth of knowledge should play a massive role in the battles to come, but what would be even more interesting is to see how his knowledge of Skull Knight's past plays into the future of the story. We know they know each other, and now that Elfhelm is destroyed, you can expect SK to show up in front of Guts at least once to strategize their next move. Getfring knowing some lethal secret about Void is exactly what we need, and we hope that's what Studio Gaga delivers to us with his character in the upcoming chapters. Demon Child, Moonlight Boy. Coming to the penultimate character on our list, this poor fellow faced hell even before he was born, and ended up being born corrupted by evil. When Guts and Casca consummated their relationship, neither of them had the sense to pull out, use a rubber, or take any sort of contraceptive measure whatsoever. As a result, Casca became pregnant, and neither of them knew about it until after the eclipse had ended. And when they did discover it, boy, was it too late for everyone involved. When Griffith violated her after being reborn as Femto, his seed went into Casca's womb and mutated the child within into a human-demon hybrid. What would usually take months to happen occurred 4 days after Femto's violation, as Casca gave birth to a malformed demon child. We know this child was associated with demonkind from the beginning, just off of his look. He had tendrils for arms, a large tumor-like growth on one side of its head, and lips that are always shaped like a perfect O. Guts, in his rage, tries to kill the child as soon as he lays hands on it, but when he realizes who the father is, he hesitates long enough to spare his own son's life. Over the course of the next 2 years, the demon child appeared in front of Guts, or in his dreams when situations were about to get dire. It came seeking only love and shelter, and received nothing but cold indifference at best and active hatred at worst. Every time he showed up in front of his father, Guts would try to kill him, or make him run away, and sometimes he put those two together to make a 5. It was when the demon child warned Guts of Casca's potential burning in St. Albion that he finally took his son seriously for a minute. This, by the way, also implies that this literal 2-year-old could interpret the flow of causality better than Slan, though that might be a subjective issue. Have it out in the comments below. See? The demon child, despite having been corrupted by a demon seed, still possessed the hardened feelings of a human. Soon after being born, it was cradled by its birth mother, and this created a transcendental bond between the two. Casca might have been mindless, but she could sense this was her child off of motherly instinct, and wanted to be with it and protect it as much as she could. The demon child ended up protecting Casca instead, especially in St. Albion, where he dispatched of numerous people and flesh-hungry blood blobs looking to take advantage of his mum by manifesting from out of nowhere. After spending nearly all of its energy trying to tank Mosgus's God's breath, the demon child runs out of energy and is on the brink of death. This is when the egg of the perfect world finds him and swallows him out of compassion. The egg knows what it's like to be shunned for what you are, even if it's perfectly natural for you to be that way. When he sees the demon child, he relates to it because he too has been mortally wounded. So the egg decides to take the child within himself and turn its body into the vessel for Griffith. Now we have to tell you that this strategy did work out and Griffith did return to the physical realm, but not without an important caveat. On every night of the full moon, the demon child would would take control of their shared body and go see its mother in the form of the Moonlight Boy. This little black-haired curiosity also happens to be the only magical entity that can stop Guts' berserker rampages with a single astral projection, so it's really sad that he only comes out once, during the full moon. When the demon child craves to be reunited with his parents and feel the nostalgic warmth of his mother's love, he simply flips a switch and takes over Griffith's vessel, returning it when he's done. It takes Griffith a few transformations to catch onto it, but once he does, he decides to bring Casca to Falconia to mitigate the consequences of disappearing randomly. What'll be harder for him to deal with is the demon child's heart, which now resides within Griffith. During the reunion on the Hill of Swords, when chunks of debris flew in Casca's direction during the fight between Guts and Zod, Griffith moved to protect her immediately. It wasn't like he did it to play mind games with Guts or Casca. He did it because the feelings of the demon child within her strongly wanted to safeguard his mother. The demon child's dedication and love for its mother is something to be written home about, even if its appearance and circumstances of birth aren't. It's a testament to the patience of a dead man seeking vengeance on ghosts, and for that, little baby, I salute you. Griffith, Femto, Moonlight Boy. Finally, we get to the belle of the ball, except this is a massacre ball, and the belle just showed up wearing a torture mask. Griffith has been called many things in the series: a brilliant strategist, a unique philosopher, a childlike playmate, and everything in between. Initially, we thought it was all part of a package that would end up ruling the world justly and with fairness. Turns out we're complete idiots, because all Griffith ever wanted was to put the world underneath his thumb. Born in an unnamed city to unnamed parents, Griffith grew up an orphan, often spending time playing with his friends on the streets. One day, as they were playing, Griffith caught sight of a dazzling castle in the foreground and decided that he was tired of collect trinkets and other odd trophies of war. He wanted that thing, and in order to get it, he dedicated his entire life to somehow becoming king. Griffith was a cunning war general and an even slyer political mastermind, as he eliminated all of his enemies both inside and outside Wyndham in short order. But he didn't expect someone he thought was his property would ever dare to leave him. When Guts left, Griffith snapped and ended up seducing Charlotte, which got him thrown in jail and tortured. As he lay there, writhing in agony and wondering about his sanity, only the thoughts of his dream and Guts provided him sustenance. He hated it, because as far as he was concerned, Guts was the root cause of all of this. Griffith refused to acknowledge his role in his own downfall, and perhaps that's where his journey to becoming a demon king really kicked off. After being visited by the God Hand in one of his delusional moments, Griffith realizes there's power in this world beyond just the physical and mental. After being broke out of his prison, he tries to reassert himself as a leader of men in various ways, but all of them end up failing. The final straw that caused Griffith to break was seeing Guts and Casca acting like a couple, which pricked his ego deeply. Griffith tried to force himself on Casca after seeing that, because, how dare she talk to anyone but him that way? When he failed to do that as well, because of his mangled body, he made a mad dash to the side of the ritual that would change his life forever. Griffith accepted the terms of his eclipse, sacrificed his comrades, descended into the abyss, and was faced by the idea of evil. When the idea told Griffith that everything that had happened in his life had been laid out by it centuries ago, for the first time, Griffith asked someone besides himself for a purpose. The idea, in return, told him to do as he wishes, because Griffith's will is ultimately the idea's will, and evil exists because humanity wills it. The idea was born of negative human emotions and thoughts. These emotions and thoughts dwell in all humans, and thus the idea can affect all of humanity through the law of cause and effect. When Griffith accepts his pre-written destiny as the prophesied Falcon of Darkness and allows his heart to be filled with evil, it's frozen in place, and he's reborn as Femto, the fifth Demon King, the blessed angel of longing. Femto's first act upon being birthed was to violate Casca, and he made sure Guts watched him do it. To Femto, this wasn't a hateful act, but one that established his dominance over the person he perceived to have led him to this point. As Femto, Griffith no longer feels things. He only pushes forward with the single-minded objective of claiming his kingdom, and he's ready to break the world and rebuild it if that's what it takes. Griffith absorbs the souls and life force of hundreds, if not thousands of people during the incarnation ceremony just to get a body of flesh. And you're telling us that's justified because he created Locus's incisive utopia? Even when Griffith does something seemingly benevolent, it's in service of his dream, with the greatest example of this being his soul liberation ritual. Most people think that he literally sends souls to hell, heaven, or purgatory based on their deeds, like he's Jesus Christ. But the truth is, every soul Griffith touches can only head in one direction, straight to hell. The very first arc of Berserk told us that all those who got entangled with demonkind are fated to end up in the abyss, and it's very telling that when Mule asks him where the souls go after he liberates them, Griffith simply replies by telling him they go to where they become one, a fancy way of describing the abyss. Charlotte thinks she's getting that work done to her because Griffith loves her, not realizing he just wants the title that comes with her. Falconians believe he's a messiah, so much so that Griffith can make even war demons coexist with humanity. But the truth is, he's barely keeping them occupied. By organizing blood sport events within the Dome of Pandemonium, Griffith delays the possibility of his apostles rampaging against his own citizens. He doesn't eliminate it. And considering the way things are shaping up right now, we wouldn't be surprised if Griffith is cooking up another mass ritual sacrificing now that he has so many humans and apostles gathered in one place. At this moment, the Falcon of Darkness has his eyes set on the east, the very place where Guts and his crew have just arrived. If Griffith's next offensive is going to be on the Eastern Front, we hope we find out some information about how to take him down before the final battle. So far, all we know is that rejecting his stupid-ass dreams and story will allow you to slap him, but what needs to be done in order to kill him remains to be seen. Maybe you need to completely cut him out of your life story to do that, or maybe you need to get him when he turns into the Moonlight Boy, because he kidnapped Casca to specifically shore up that particular weakness. If the Moonlight Boy is killable, then it makes all the sense in the world why Griffith wouldn't want Casca to be with Guts and co. While we don't condone killing children on this channel, if stopping the Mad Falcon mean we have to say goodbye to the Moonlight Boy, then by all means. Griffith is the perfect example of a villain in hero's disguise, because people in the Berserkverse think he's their Christ, when in reality he's worse than the Antichrist. Marvelous verdict, and that's it for this list. We know this was a long one, so we won't bore you with a tedious outro. Just let us know what you thought about this list in the comments below. If you want to see more mega anime lists like this one, click subscribe and turn the notification bell to all. Like this video and share it to help spread the word. We'll see you guys in the next one, and remember, keep struggling, strugglers.